Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. It's December 20th, 2024, and we are super excited today, again, to be covering Joseph Smith's first vision. It would seem the most simple and straightforward part of Mormon history, the founding of Mormonism, that many would attribute the first vision to being. You know, it should be as simple as Joseph Smith tells us what happened, and then God's one true church rolls forth like a stone cut out of the mountains without hands to consume all nations. But alas, it's not that simple, right, Sandra?
That's right.
So it turns out that in one of the most bold SEO plays in all of sort of Mormon discourse in 2024, a new YouTube channel has popped up called CES Letters, which is just simply a brazen attempt at grabbing CES Letter SEO and then trying to promote apologetic, faithful beliefs through that attempt. That's what we're doing. This is an ongoing series of us, me, Gerardo, Sandra, Dan Vogel, and sometimes a special guest, basically responding to the Mormon Church's attempts in modern day to try to explain problems in Mormon Church history. So recently, BYU Professor, I believe his name is Stephen Harper, who I believe is one of the founding authors of the Mormon Church's first vision essay in the Gospel Topics Essays. He has recorded a new video through the CES Letters YouTube channel, trying to help us all feel better about and restore belief in the credibility of Joseph Smith's first vision. And since this series has been so popular, we are here for it to respond. So we have legendary scholar Sandra Tanner back with us. Hey, Sandra.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
You and your late husband, Gerald, are the founders of Utah Lighthouse Ministry. Is that right?
Right.
And you've now spent how many decades thinking about this stuff?
Over 60 years.
60 years.
Ooh, yeah.
And we've actually done first vision discussions on Mormon stories.
Yeah.
So, but you're back, so you just can't get enough of this stuff.
That's right. Some people just don't know when to quit.
Well, we're really glad you're here. So thanks for joining us. Also joining us is Gerardo. Hey, Gerardo.
Hey, John.
Why did you want to do this again?
Because it was really fun the first two times, and then we want to respond to the founder of CES Letters YouTube channel, which I think is Stephen Harper.
He's like the project manager.
Yeah, project manager. And honestly, I hadn't heard his name before. I probably while watching Dan Vogel's videos he came up, but didn't notice like how influential he's been in the church, especially under this topic of the first vision.
Yeah.
So,
if you're asked to be one of the original authors of one of the Gospel Topics essays, clearly the church sees you as important.
yeah,
So
and he's a Joseph Smith Papers Project editor and
all that.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, if these weren't enough heavy guns for you, we also have probably the top living official Joseph Smith scholar in the world today, Dan Vogel, joining us. Hey, Dan.
Hi, great to be here.
How's Ohio treating you?
Well, it's just getting a little chilly, not too bad yet.
Yeah. Are you ready? Are you ready to respond to the apologetic scholar, Stephen Harper? Are you ready?
Yeah, of course, I'm well aware of Stephen Harper. I respect him. He's one of the top historians of Joseph Smith, and especially the first vision. He's published a few books just on the first vision, believe it or not. So it could be a big topic, and it's an important topic to believing Mormons. But I think we'll introduce some problems with the first vision and give you a little bit of history about first vision historiography, and because it has a long history, and it kind of got touched off with Wesley Walters, who was one of my favorite people when he was alive. And and I have maybe a different interpretation than Harper and Walters, actually.
Yeah. Well, we're excited to get your perspective. Sandra, you're a Wes Walters fan, right?
Oh, yeah. Wes was a wonderful guy
Yeah.
and a very meticulous historian.
Right. Yeah. Well, speaking of meticulous historians, we have as a special guest for you today a brand new guest on Mormon Stories podcast. We have Winston DeLynn. Hey, Winston.
Oh, hi.
How are you doing?
Good. I didn't think that was me after that introduction.
Are you a meticulous scholar of Mormonism?
Yeah, I don't know about that.
So this is my idea to bring Winston on. It's is it come with your dad to work day or bring your son to work day? Which is it?
Yeah.
Something
Either
like
way.
that. And Winston, we were talking about this. You were wondering whether everyone would think that your childhood was basically talking in depth about Mormon history, but I'm not so sure that was your childhood. Is that right?
Yeah, it definitely wasn't. I've been pretty indifferent about Mormonism. We haven't talked about it pretty much at all. I don't know a lot about these topics or the visions at all.
So people would wonder, how could you be John DeLynn's son and grow up almost talking none about Mormon church history? How is that possible?
Well, it turns out I think it gets old after a while. I don't think when your job is talking about Mormonism, I don't think it's really fun to go home and talk Mormonism with your family.
So you're saying I didn't come home wanting to talk about the first vision to you?
That wasn't my experience.
Okay. We kind of avoided talking about it. So this is all going to be pretty new to you, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So the reason why we like to bring people like Zeke or Winston or others on is just to get kind of a younger, fresh, new eyes take on what's going on, kind of as a sanity check. Does that sound all right, Sandra?
Okay.
So Winston's going to call your BS if you're,
All
if you're
right.
throwing out
Yes.
some
All
BS.
right. Good.
Is that all right?
Yeah.
Winston, you ready to challenge Sandra?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what I'm here for sure.
All right. Dan, are you intimidated by Winston?
Well, yes, because we'll have to explain a lot to him, it sounds like.
No. He's just going to ask a question or two or make a point here or there. Anyway. All right.
Should we explain who Wesley Walters is? Because he's going to come up quite a bit.
Okay. Yeah. Sandra, do you want to tell us who Wesley Walters is?
Wesley Walters was a Presbyterian minister. He served for a while in New York and then later in Illinois. And because of the proximity to major Mormon sites, he had become interested in the Mormon story. So besides his theological duties and his work at his church, he started studying Mormon subjects, and as, I don't know if you'd say a hobby, but as a sideline to his religious studies. And in the process, got intrigued with the challenges of trying to decide how the movement actually started and how the timeline would play out. And it occurred to him that Joseph Smith made specific claims in his published first vision account in the Mormon scriptures, where he said that there were a revival in a neighborhood that caused him to go out in the woods to pray. And Wes thought, well, okay, I can't study whether or not someone saw a vision in the woods, but I can look into whether there was a revival like he talks about in his neighborhood, and launched him into a very specific study of the whole New York area and the revivals, the church growth, and all those things that would have challenged Joseph Smith's narrative. And he published on it, did a number of articles, and wrote a book with Mike Marquardt, Inventing Mormonism. And I believe that he kicked off the church's deep dive into trying to reconcile the early church history. Well, and I think Harper acknowledges that when we see later the clip or whatever you're going to show about Harper, he acknowledges that Wes challenged the revivals in New York as Joseph Smith claimed for 1820. And so it he was a major factor in making the church historian's office seriously go back and re-examine the story.
Brilliant. Okay, well, that's good context.
Wasn't he the one also who found some of the a document about Joseph Smith's treasure digging and the
Yes, the 1826 trial documents.
yeah.
He found them in Norwich, New York, in the basement of the jail. And if it hadn't been for Wes finding those, they would have been forever lost to history.
Yeah. So he was important.
It was very important.
Yeah.
That's back in the 60s.
Yeah.
Before most of you were born.
Right. Yeah, I was born in the 60s, 69. Does that count?
Oh,
Close
wow.
it up.
All right. Well, Gerardo, you kind of produced this one. Do you want to kick things off?
Yeah.
How do you want to start?
So, well, I wanted to tell the story of going into being at BYU Idaho and getting on, starting to study church history and going into my faith crisis. One of the first things that I decided to do was take a class. I still had some religion classes that I had to take, so I decided to take a Pearl of Great Price class because I was wondering, how do they teach all of these issues that I'm learning about? And I remember when we got to study the first vision in class, the professor wrote in the whiteboard the timeline of the first vision according to Joseph Smith 1838 account. And he had some, he had like the dates and like, or whatever, like this happened here and this happened here, and then the vision. And I raised my hand and I said, well, there's some problems with the timeline because this, we're going to talk about it later. This Lucy Smith didn't join the Presbyterian Church until after 1823, which would be 3 years after the vision. So that couldn't have been influential in Joseph's wanting to search for the true church. And the kind of like the professor was kind of taken back by it. And then he came back the next class and he told me, like, I studied it and you were right. Lucy Smith didn't convert until later. So
Lucy being Joseph's mom.
Yes. Yeah. So there are a lot of things that, that Joseph mentions in this account, in the 1838 account that's canonized, that present big issues into the narrative and kind of where do you put in the timeline when this the supposed first vision happened. And a lot of it is not going to be touched by Stephen Harper, so we're going to have the opportunity to talk about it. But I just wanted to give that quick intro.
Okay.
And so first to start, there are a couple clips. One of them was sent to me by Dan, where Stephen Harper is giving his opinion on Dan Vogel. And throughout the whole clip that we're going to, the whole video that we're going to show, he will mention Dan a couple times, but you'll see that the perspective that he gives on this clip that we're going to show first is a little bit different from how he'll talk about Dan later.
Okay, so our first clip is Stephen Harper sharing his opinions about Dan Vogel, scholar.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Let's
and Fawn Brodie.
And Fawn Brodie. Okay. All right. Let's roll the clip.
About the scholarship. Fawn Brodie was not a good historian. She was a brilliant writer, not a good historian. Dan Vogel knows his historical stuff.
He does.
Right? He knows his business. So the difference between how he would interpret things and how I would is simply faith. It's believing. It's a decision to believe Joseph Smith or not believe Joseph Smith.
Yeah.
Now, the way you make that decision will determine how you read the exact same evidence, right? You know the same facts, read the same documents. And so it's a decision about whether belief is legitimate or desirable and so on. It's really not a historical question at all.
Yeah.
At that point, both of us have to give interpretation. We have to read meaning into the historical facts.
Yeah.
And we decide to.
So if blasphemy is possible on Mormon Stories podcast, the closest thing you could do to commit blasphemy is to say Fawn Brodie wasn't a good historian. So really quickly, that's only meaningful if you know who Fawn Brodie was. So for those who don't know, Winston, you probably don't know, Fawn Brodie was the niece of an earlier Mormon prophet, David O. McKay. His niece, Fawn McKay Brodie, published what I think is still among, let's just say, the top 2 or 3 best biographies on Joseph Smith, because I have one of the authors here. I have to be careful to show proper respect to Dan Vogel. But I still think No Man Knows My History is among the best, if not the best, biography ever written on Joseph Smith. And she had access to a lot of good source documents, maybe not all of them. But if people are going to read one book, it's still hard not to recommend No Man Knows My History. So, Sandra, what's your immediate reaction to Harper claiming that just waving legendary scholar Fawn Brodie off as not a good historian?
Well, it's just so dismissive. She was so pivotal to the study, launching us into history in early Mormonism. She took on the church official narrative clear back in 1945, and to challenge it was just unheard of. Members did not challenge the First Vision story or the whole history of early Mormonism. So
certainly not as the niece of the prophet.
Right. And her book was a real thunderstorm. When it came out, it caused tremendous ripples through the community, because it was such a challenge to the regular narrative. And it was the very fact that it was well researched that sent the church into years of trying
Decades.
to defend the story against Fawn Brodie's attacks.
Yeah.
And my story comes out of Fawn Brodie's book. Her book influenced my mother, who in turn influenced me. Her book influenced Gerald. Her book influenced everyone. We all took Brodie as our starting point, as launching us into studying the different accounts. So to just dismiss her like, oh, she wasn't even a good historian. Oh my goodness. She launched Mormon church history.
Yeah. And it's also weird because Richard Bushman himself shows great respect to Fawn Brodie. And he's a Harvard/Columbia based historian. So that was weird. Julia was like gasping. But Dan Vogel, you also are, maybe the top living Joseph Smith historian, I'd say. What do you think about waving off Fawn Brodie as not a good historian?
Well, she is outdated because we have so many more sources and other perspectives from sociology and psychology and things like that that isn't evident in her book, although some people think she is a psychohistorian, but not really. And but she's I first started reading her as soon as I got off my mission, and from her I learned Joseph Smith was a polygamist. I didn't know that before. I thought Brigham Young was the guy that launched it off, even though Joseph Smith had a revelation. So I was in my early 20s when I read it. It had a great impact on me. I tried to meet her once, but she had already been, sick and diagnosed with cancer, and didn't come to her office that often. So when I was at UCLA trying to look her up, I missed her. And she only came in to get her mail, I was told. But I was still a believer when I read it. So I had some things to work through still myself. But she,
I want to say something.
At the time, she was the state of the art. Okay. At the time, she was the state of the art, even though nowadays we've added a lot of more material and contours to Joseph Smith's personality that, and I'm sure she would have been thrilled and just kept right up with it as long as she could. And anyway, I count her as a legitimate, a good historian. I certainly didn't agree with Hugh Nibley's criticisms in his little pamphlet. But yeah, she got a lot of response from the Mormon historians, but it's mostly because she caught them flat-footed. She was way ahead of them, put it that way.
Yeah. Sandra?
Well, people say today, well, and that's true what Dan brought out. She didn't have access to the documents we have available to today. But why is that? That's not her fault. It wasn't because she was a lazy learner or didn't study or didn't go to enough libraries. The church was sitting on the important material that she needed to know. Now, in her first edition of her book, she raised the issue of some sort of problem with the first vision, but she didn't have access to the 1832 account on the first vision. And
why was that, Sandra?
Because Joseph Fielding Smith was sitting on it and had it hidden away in his vault.
Yeah.
And when it came out later, she brought out a new edition of her book in, I think, 71 or 2, something like that. And she did put in more material. Had she lived, I'm sure she would have done the same further down the line with other things that came out. But for its day, it was monumental.
Yeah.
And yes, Dan and everyone else has brought the record forward with more material, but to denigrate someone that was such a groundbreaking research is just it's just not fair to her. She did such a good job for what she had available to her. It's phenomenal.
So give me a number, Sandra. If there's a pie chart of 100% facts, how much of what's relevant to the truth claims of Joseph Smith's overall history did Fawn Brodie get right? Give me a pie chart percentage.
Well, I don't know, 95%.
Okay, 95 is pretty good, especially in 1945. Dan, would you say 95 or would you give her a lower number?
No, we haven't really changed the facts that she brought forward. We've only added to it.
Right.
But we have more different perspectives. Like for me, I saw Joseph Smith more as wrestling with a true religious aspect to his personality, whereas she kind of left that out of her picture because she was describing a con man, and that's usually the first thing you go to when you say, well, it's not true, and then you go to the con man thing. And later, I think other people started seeing things that she didn't or couldn't at the time. It's just, that's the way history is.
Yeah.
It develops and grows, and whoever puts forward a better explanation, starts influencing the community of scholars.
Yeah. So it's not that she got stuff wrong. What she wrote, she pretty much got right. We've just been able to add new stuff to it.
Yes. Well, the difference of perspective, like Dan was bringing out, whether you just flat out see him as a deliberate inventor of his story, or you see him as a religious person trying to formulate some sort of religious movement, how much sincerity do you want to grant him? And the scale goes from total fraud to total prophet walking with God. And Dan and I would put our marks on that continuum in a little different spaces. I would probably give him a little more fraud than Dan would. Dan would be kinder and give him a little more sincerity, pious. But the bottom line is, so much of his story can be shown to be inaccurate that it leaves you fighting for trying to figure out what was the motivation and how much sincerity do you give him. His story as told in the history of the church, in the back of the Pearl of Great Price, just is not how Mormonism really started.
Yeah. Really quickly, Sandra, what would be his motive for denigrating her? What would be Stephen Harper's motive for denigrating Fawn Brodie?
Well, he knows her book was so important to so many people, that he's trying to lessen its importance to people.
Yeah.
And the fact that it is such an older biography, it's easier to push it aside as being, well, that's old stuff. We don't need to think about that anymore. But I think she still raises important questions that still have to be answered today.
Yeah. It was certainly instrumental in Margie and my disaffection from the church. I can say that.
Well, what's so interesting is he has so much respect for Richard Bushman. He brings it up over and over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And Richard Bushman quotes or uses Fawn Brodie as
more than any other source.
Yeah, one of his main sources for his most important book, Roast and
So
Rolling.
you can't love Richard Bushman and hate Fawn Brodie because Richard Bushman quotes Fawn Brodie more than anyone else.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Good point. Okay, Gerardo, do we want to, what next video?
Yeah.
Okay, you've got one more video. Do you want to tell us what this video is about?
I think so. These are clips from a podcast he went on with Mormonism with the Murph, and the perspective he gives here about the first vision is quite different from the video we're gonna actually play. You can tell that he talks different when he knows he's talking to members, which the CES Letters videos are, and here where he's talking to skeptics
Or scholars.
Yeah. So we're gonna play this one first and then
Okay.
evaluate the rest of the video.
All right, let's roll the clip.
I don't find any reason to think Joseph Smith is trying to change his story or his theology over time. Now, that's different from saying there are no changes in the story or theology over time. Okay, I'll grant that there are, no problem with that. That's what we would expect. Line on line, precept on precept, interpretive memory. Okay, so I'll give you changes in the story over time and changes in theology over time. The question is, how intentional is it? How manipulative is Joseph? How duplicitous? That's where I don't find the arguments compelling. I don't find Joseph to be insincere or a liar or somebody trying to pull wool over my eyes. There's nothing in the accounts that would tell.
Okay, and that's exactly what Sandra just said.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
today will partly be what were Joseph Smith's motives? Was it just honest, the fish is getting bigger because you just remember it bigger each time you tell the story, or was he intentionally changing the story to manipulate and fool people?
Right.
That'll
And he
be part
gives
of
it
what we
right
answer today. Yeah.
That's the question.
Okay. Really quickly, in the video we're about to watch, this will be my cold reaction to it. Do they tell what the original official narrative is? Do they start with that, or should we just offer that very quickly?
I think we can offer it.
It's not going to be repeat with the video.
Mm-mm.
Sandra, will you give us the official narrative of Joseph Smith's first vision? Let's just say a summary of the 1838 account.
Well, in that account, Joseph tells that there was a religious revival in his neighborhood, in his town and area. And through the excitement of religion, he was stirred up to pray to know what church to join. All were making these different claims that competed with one another. So he goes out into the woods and prays. As a 14-year-old boy in 1820, and these dates are important, that as this 14-year-old boy, he goes into the woods to pray, and two beings appear, and one says to the other, "This is my beloved son, hear him." And then Jesus talks to Joseph Smith and tells him he's not to join any church, for they're all wrong, they're all corrupt. And then after this vision, later, he on his when he gets back home, his mom asks him how things are going or whatever, and he says, "I've found out for myself that Presbyterianism isn't true." And this is important because in his first vision account, he says the revival happened among the Methodists, Baptists, and Presbyterians. And that's when Lucy, the mom, and several of her kids join the Presbyterian church. So it's important when he says, "I learned for myself that Presbyterianism isn't true," that it's a response to his mom's interest in the Presbyterian church.
Okay.
Then the first vision account goes on to talk about the angel coming in 1823. But the first vision part is set very specifically 1820, when he's 14, in the woods. Two beings appear that are supposed to be God and Jesus, and they tell him that none of the churches are right and that it had never entered his mind before that that was the case.
Okay. All right. So that's it. 1820, 14 years old, God and Jesus appearing, doing it because he was trying to figure out which church was true, because there was a revival preceding pretty close, and he was trying to figure it out.
And his mom had,
and he went and tells his mom.
And his mom had, and he says his mom and some of his siblings had joined the Presbyterian church.
Okay.
So that's why after he has a vision, he tells his mom, "Hey, guess what? Your church is not true."
Okay. And then maybe most importantly, would a mainstream Mormon ever be told there were multiple versions of this vision and that this is a later account?
No, when I was going to seminary, of course, it was clear back in the 1950s, when I went to seminary and when I took institute classes, I never heard of anything about any account except the one printed in Mormon scriptures, the printed 1842 printing of the 38 written account.
Yeah.
One vision, one account, two beings, God and Jesus.
Yeah. And we know now that the church had knowledge of and possession of the other accounts,
Yes.
and intentionally and knowingly hid them for reasons that we'll discuss in a minute. But that's
Yes.
important. Dan, anything you want to add to kind of what the official narrative is and how it influenced, how it has impacted us today? You don't have to say anything. I just want to give you a chance.
Well, I would only add that it's kind of strangely written that so Joseph Smith, he says that God, the Father introduces the Son. This is my beloved Son, hear ye him. And then Joseph says, no sooner did I get possession of myself that I asked the question. So he interrupts Jesus. It just reads so odd to me that why is Joseph talking? Which church is true and which should I join? Jesus, the Father just said, listen to Jesus. So before Jesus could even talk, Joseph Smith interrupts him with a question. That's just little thing I would add, that it's kind of a contrived account when I read it. Well, the whole first part of the history of the church, the 72 pages that Joseph Smith supposedly worked on before he was martyred. The whole thing is myth.
Julia, you're like gasping audibly, so I'm just going to call an audible, have you join us and tell us why you're laughing and like throwing your arms up in the air.
So I've studied this for a long time, and I've never thought about him interrupting Jesus. So like, this is just really funny to me, like hear him. And yet Joseph's like, wait a minute, hang on, I have to ask you a question. I've just never thought about that.
You're saying if the creator of the universe and of all things appeared to you in all his majesty with his only begotten son, the savior of all mankind, you would go, wait, just 1 second before you continue. I got a question. You're saying that wouldn't be your first response?
No, I'd shut up and listen. But like, Dan, you're right.
Okay. All right. Well, that's why we have Dan and Sandra on. Winston, any quick reactions so far?
No major reactions. I mean, it's really funny. It's a funny story, but so far it's all like it's things that can be covered by the excuse of like memory is faulty, and I feel like there are much more like problematic errors like in the differences of the accounts, I think.
So we'll get there. We're getting there. Yeah. All right. We just want to set it up because, a lot of people are learning this stuff for the first time.
No, of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah.
I just come from like a much more, I don't know, I guess analytical place, but it's hilarious still.
All right. Well, you jump in anytime. All right.
Yeah, of course I am.
Okay. All right. So Gerardo, do we go just to the video now?
Let's do it. Yeah.
Okay. So this is the video that we're going to be talking about today. And we'll just
1.5 speed.
Yeah. Oh, we want to do it 1.5 speed because they're kind of slow speakers. Is that right, Gerardo?
Pretty slow.
Why are you laughing, Dan Vogel? That's rude. That's rude to laugh.
I
at
watched it
people.
at 2x speed and it was still boring.
It's still
so.
slow.
Okay. All right. We're missing these camera reactions, Julia. Julia's in there like raising her arms, laughing hysterically, and she's not switching the camera. All right. She's still not switching the camera. Julia, switch the gosh dang camera.
I'm sorry. This is just funny to me.
Why are you laughing?
Because like they're right. Like it is. I had to watch it on really fast speed too. Anyway, yeah.
Okay. All right. We're switching back. All right. Let's go ahead and start. And any of you can stop at any time. Is that all right?
All right.
Just say stop, stop, stop. All right. Here we go.
Church history in Nauvoo. So I read his book. He taught me all about the multiple accounts of the first vision. So my awareness and exposure to them came from a different philosophical approach than the way the CES Letter or other skeptical approaches take, right? They say, well, did you know there are 4 accounts? And there's something sinister in that. And it's supposed to be disconcerting. If you study with Milton Bachman, so he's an Ivy League PhD, University of Pennsylvania PhD. He's a fantastic historian, great at the historical method. And he doesn't teach me that way. He says, my goodness, did you know there's these multiple accounts of vision? We get to study them this semester. Right? Can you imagine a greater thing to do? So my whole orientation is different. And that's why,
all right, go ahead, Winston.
To me, like when I heard that so far, like he's saying that he's coming at it from a perspective of like open-mindedness to the changes in the 4 accounts rather than like being skeptical about it. And he says that a couple times in this video. It is like, it's just, you know, the truth is that differences in accounts is something that would discredit an idea generally. It's possible that someone's account could change over time 4 times, you know, but it's not that like, you know, we want to come at it from an angle of like, you know, this is fine, like let's trust it anyways. You know, it is something that like would discredit it and you would want a good reason to believe it despite the story changing, you know, just from like a logical perspective.
You're basically saying he's kind of owning his bias from the outset?
Yeah, well, in this video he taught like, and it, you know, this is like the kind of the first time he says, you know, you need to come at these visions from a perspective of trust rather than being skeptical of the fact that they change. You know, when the fact that they change is problematic, you know, it's not the only reason that they're false, but, you know, that it's not something that you just, you know, ignore.
Well, I think most people would say, well, of course, if you tell the story to different people, different times, there'll be some differences in how you tell the story. But the problem is, are we talking about differences of just what would happen in a normal telling it at different times to different people? Or are the differences significant enough that you would say, no, this is an actual changing of the narrative. This is more than just a little different angle than what you told at a different time. We can allow for some differences in people retelling a story, but if major changes happen, a difference of 4 years, difference of when it's supposed to have happened, a difference of whether it's God and Jesus or angels, I think is important. Whether he already knew the churches were all false or God had to tell him that because he had never thought of it before. Those are kinds of differences that would lead you to question the experience. They aren't the kind of things where you'd say, oh, well, I just forgot to mention this or that part before. You're actually changing the narrative.
Got it.
Yes, I have a comment to make on that. So some accounts you would expect for there to be added details or a little changed details here and there, and that's true with the accounts that come after the 1838 account. Like Orson Pratt's 1840 account, Orson Hyde's 1842 account, Joseph Smith's letter to John Whitworth, Joseph Smith's interview with David White in the New York Spectator, and Alexander Niebuhr's journal. These all come after the 1838 account. They follow the pattern of the 1838 account, but they vary in detail. That's totally understandable. But the 1832 account has major differences that can't be reconciled with the 1838 account, as we'll see. Also, when he talks about the hermeneutics of trust and the hermeneutics of skepticism and doubt, and the thing is that any good historian has a methodological skepticism with everything, and that's the stance you should take with every account. It is skepticism so that you can ferret out the what's right and what's wrong, what's exaggerated, what's not. So it's not about trust. I mean, what historian talks about, oh, I trust this witness? I mean, why historians would never say that phrase. Oh, it's a matter of trust. I trust Joseph. What historians don't do that. That's so. It really bothers me when it was Bushman that brought up the hermeneutics of trust, and that there's something wrong. See, this is actually a disguised ad hominem. Okay, you're just distrusting. That's why you can't trust. You get Joseph Smith, and he contradicts himself, and you make too much out of these contradictions. And the thing is that we don't. You are if you're just trusting Joseph and you're just trying to explain away the contradictions, you're missing an opportunity. As every historian looks for an opportunity to learn something. For these contradictions have something to teach us. Why are these contradictions there? They're just not there because he's telling the story in a different way, maybe to a different audience. They're there because his theology is also evolving. So from one God to many gods, as he gets, as he ends up in Nauvoo teaching many gods. So Joseph Smith's theology is developing, which it should be used to interpret this development that Harper says he doesn't like. This development, historians look for development, over time, and you can see it in the narrative, but you can also see that some of the narrative is changing because of what's changing outside that narrative also.
Yeah. There's also power dynamics. Go ahead.
What's so interesting is that Stephen, in that little clip that we showed, he acknowledged that there is change in theology between the different accounts.
Yeah, he does.
And he says, well, and then the question is, how malicious is this changing of theology? And I don't think anyone is making an argument that he's maliciously changing his theology. Rather, he is evolving as he's learning more stuff. Not necessarily like he's getting revelations from God, but he's just learning Hebrew and reading the scriptures more and getting evolving in what he thinks God is,
but also changing the story
and evolving the story as he goes on.
Okay, all right, should we keep going? Let's keep going.
Why I felt this longing over time that I wish I could help people have that experience that I had. And then another major catalyst is the 2008 summer seminar that Richard Bushman led at BYU. For years and years, he would gather students, scholars together in the summer, and they'd tackle some problem or other. And the opportunity I had to attend was in 2008, and the topic was Joseph Smith and his critics. And Professor Bushman did what Professor Bushman does, which was take a charitable approach, both to historical figures, right, and to the critics, and to their victims, to those who are impacted by their attacks on the restored gospel. He said, let's stop, fighting with the critics. Let's turn our attention to those who are hurt by them, whose faith is diminished or undermined. What could we do for them? Today we would use the term minister. What should be our ministry to them? And so with that way of thinking in mind, we sort of chose topics to write about. And I picked the first vision. And it was a turning point for me because I already knew the evidence, the historical record. I knew it pretty well by then. But what I had not done is thought about how would I respond to the critics of the first vision, Fawn, Brodie, or Reverend Wesley Walters, the Methodist minister even, who rejected it right out of hand. How would I respond to them like Professor Bushman does, with faith and hope and with charity? Intense well informed by the historical method, not a sort of lackadaisical or nonchalant or mediocre approach in terms of history, writing, and thinking, but also not being a jerk, right? Not making the problem worse by responding without those. Professor Bushman calls it the hermeneutic of trust. Let's take a trusting approach to Joseph Smith. That doesn't mean a non-critical approach, a non-analytical approach, but it means let's not start with the prejudice that he is a lying con man from the beginning. Let's see what the historical record offers us. And at the same time, let's not go in there with guns blazing toward people who don't believe him or haven't accepted his witness. Maybe we could imagine why there are sound or valid reasons for their choices too, right? We could approach them with the kind of respect that human beings deserve. So
really quickly, when I hear him talking there, and this is the first time I've heard this, I hear him just basically trying to say, let's be objective historians. Let's not bring our biases too much to our look at Joseph Smith's portrayal of the first vision. He is saying, probably on the one hand, that you can have a faithful perspective, but he's also just saying, let's not come with our minds made up that he's a lying fraud. Let's try to be as objective as possible given our limitations. Isn't that fair or not?
I hear something different.
What'd you hear?
I hear him saying that on one hand, he keeps saying like the historical process or whatever scientific process, but the goal of like historical and scientific process is to come up with a theory and then try to disprove it so you can see if it's wrong, and he's flipping the script to like, well, let's see if you can make it work like in your brain, like that this could make sense, but that is completely not how the process works at all. Yeah. And if you're using that as your methodology, the problem is that you look at like Muhammad's claims or like other religions, and you're not going to be able to disprove them either from a standpoint of trust and trying to make things work in your head,
Yeah, that's exactly how I saw it. And he talked about the critics and their victims.
Yeah, how many victims do you have, Sandra?
Well, quite a few.
What's your body count, Sandra?
I don't know what the count is, but I think that I think they are trying to be a kinder, gentler apologetics, and not just throw out barbs at the opposition. However, he does, somewhere along in his interview, he says that all the facts are out there and there are legitimate reasons people believe or don't believe, knowing all the stories, all the accounts about the first vision, and he can respect people that end up not believing. He can understand why they wouldn't, but he ends up on the side of believing. Well, that tells you that the Joseph Smith story is not that clearly laid out as a matter of faith, because he's conceding that those that end up without faith in Joseph Smith have legitimate reasons for that.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead, Dan. Did you want to add something?
Oh, yeah. So I heard him say he chose the first vision as a ministry. And that he was going to minister to other members who had questions about the first vision, not with guns blazing against the critics or anything. What I wanted to hear him say is, well, I wanted to learn more about the first vision and see where the facts would take me, because I didn't really know that much about the first vision, and I would learn about it. And so instead, I heard him say that he already had his mind made up before he even started studying the first vision.
Right.
Yeah. I'm going to just also add just a tiny little interesting historical footnote. I attended one session of this 2008 seminar. I was able to find on the Juvenile Instructor, I think, which is an old, or maybe it's Mormon Chronicles. It's like somebody's summary of the 2008 seminar. I was in conversation with Richard Bushman at the time. I had interviewed him on Mormon Stories. I had started doing my work on why people are leaving the church. By that time, I had produced my first YouTube video on why people are leaving the Mormon church. I had interviewed people like Grant Palmer and others, and Bushman had me come down and present to this seminar. And some of the people that were there, Stephen Harper was there, Brian Hauglid was there, Spencer Fluman was there, Carrie Mulstein was there, and Richard Bushman was there, among others. So it was fun that they had even me come down. That was 3 years after Mormon Stories started and 7 years before my excommunication. So I had a small part to play in that seminar as well.
Nice.
Anyway, all right, should we keep going? Let's keep going with the video.
Way of thinking and being more Christ-like, at the same time, more analytically minded and more Christ-like is a major blessing to me. It really, I don't think we'd be doing CES letters the way we're doing it if I hadn't had that experience quite a long time ago. And I don't mean to suggest that I've mastered it the way Professor Bushman has in my judgment, but I'm really grateful for that mentoring. And that's why from then on, I wrote a seminar paper, but I started researching the first vision. And as you said, a series of books and articles come out of that, including the one you mentioned was published by Oxford University Press. And I say that because it's a big deal. Yeah.
Big deal.
Oxford University Press doesn't publish books that they think are hack or not passing muster, academically speaking. To reach that threshold shows that that they think it reaches the highest standard of academic integrity and historical method, that its claims are defensible, and that it advances knowledge in a useful way. So to me, that was a really big deal. I wanted to accomplish that in my career.
Was it the book that took the most?
All right, really quick. So Winston, you wanted to pause. I'm curious.
Yeah, sorry.
Why?
Sorry, I feel like I'm talking a lot.
No.
I'm
we
the
want
least
you here.
educated person here, but but I would just like to say, I mean, saying that your book is published by a journal or whatever, and that means that it's like held to this like really high standard. I mean, they've published books for Islam, they've published books for Hinduism, they've published books for like everything. So to say that that your book is like more credible because it was published by them. I mean, they've published things for all religions, so it really says nothing. Sorry.
In terms of comparing religions in their truthfulness to each other.
Yes.
Is that what you mean?
Yes. In terms of like the validity of the things in your book.
And I was really interested in the coincidence because we had Professor Ryan Cragen on recently on Mormon Stories podcast, who just released a book about like people leaving religion in the United States. And he published his book with New York University Press. And just jokingly, because it seems like everyone and their dog is publishing with Oxford, I instinctively said to Ryan Cragen, why didn't you publish this with Oxford University Press? This is just last week. And he said, because it's not a super reputable press, that like they'll publish almost anything. Obviously, there's some academic standard, but I was surprised to hear Ryan Cragen's opinion of Oxford University Press to be quite low. Sandra or Dan, do either of y'all have anything in response to what Winston said or to what Ryan Cragen has said about Oxford?
Well, I'm not in a position to evaluate Oxford other than the fact that they seem to be in love with Mormonism. They just seem to print a whole bookshelf of things on Mormonism. And I don't know that means Oxford's promoting Mormonism, but for whatever reason, they've chosen to publish their books.
Like, aren't most of Terrell Givens's books published with Oxford University Press?
I think so.
Yeah. Dan, anything you want to add about
Harris book, Second Class Saints?
Was it
At Oxford University?
No, it was not. No, I don't think so. But Gerardo, you fact check that. Dan Vogel, anything you want to say about Oxford Press?
Well, no, not really. Just because it's published by, peer review, peer review isn't really what it's represented to be, really. I've learned.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that is an appeal to authority. And so I guess the point is whether or not they're great or mediocre.
Well, have you, I haven't read the book. Have you, Dan, have you reviewed the book?
Stephen? Yeah. Have you reviewed Stephen Harper's first
what
vision
is it
book?
not Stephen?
Well, I handle his arguments in my 3 videos on my YouTube channel.
Yeah. Okay.
But basically, my understanding of what the book is just interviewing a bunch of academics, psychologists, and neuroscientists about how memory works, and kind of justify.
that book I haven't read.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a new book that, it sounds interesting to me. I know his arguments on memory that he's going to get into, and I'll have a few comments when that comes up. But he's written 3 books, I believe, on the first vision. I got those, but I don't have the one where he talks about memory. But he does talk about memory in association with the first vision, which I know his arguments from that point of view.
Well, Gerardo did a fact check, and he was right. The amazing book, Second Class Saints by Matt Harris, was indeed, according to Gerardo, published by Oxford University Press. So clearly they do some good stuff.
Yeah, I don't think that, like, I wasn't trying to say that they're not credible, but my point is just that if your point is that, they published your work on your religion because they thought it was credible, well, you don't believe credible. You don't believe in all of these other ones, and they published all of them too. So the logic it doesn't work. It doesn't work for your own beliefs.
Yeah. It doesn't make a church more or less true.
And he'll explain that the book is about, again, interviewing academics and then saying, well, Joseph could have had faulty memory based on what this academic said. So, I mean, he's not saying the first vision happened, believe me, and then Oxford published it.
Yeah. The quality of the press doesn't support or buttress your truth claims as a religion, because they're going to publish books from all the religions.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Let's keep listening.
Effort, would you say?
Yeah, in some ways it is, right? It takes a decade to write a book like that.
Right.
And I don't know if it took, the most raw hours, but definitely you got to read widely, right?
Mm-hmm.
I realized along the way that the insight I could offer, the new dimension I could explore, is what would happen if you married, the historical method, reading the historical documents carefully and thoroughly and in light of their context. What would happen if you married that with the science of memory studies, with this, what psychologists and memory scholars have discovered about the nature of memory? And that's what the book is. It's the marriage of those two things, those two disciplines. So I could do the historical part myself, and then I had to consult the world's experts on memory formation and reformation, or consolidation. And that was a lot of fun. It's a really stretching,
I'm sure,
exercise, and I still feel proud about it. I'm really grateful for that book. Among other things, it makes it hard to say, well, Steve Harper doesn't know what he's talking about.
Right.
You can say a lot of other things, right? Granted, I'm not Richard Bushman, that's for sure, but I know
you're
what
also
I'm talking
half his
about.
age, so
yeah. I know what I'm talking about when it comes to the first vision of Joseph Smith.
Right. It's really impressive. And I think that gives kind of a good preface to what we're going to be discussing today. And so just to kind of give a layout, and this is going to be a quick one. We already have 2 other episodes. This one, we're just going to do a higher quality. So we're just going to spend a couple minutes on each of these. Mm-hmm. And that is 4 different accounts to the first vision. 4 different primary accounts of the first vision, contradictions, late appearances of the first vision, and we'll look at the time and see where we go from there. The first thing, though, that I'd like to talk about is President Gordon B. Hinckley said, and this is at the beginning of this section of the CES letter, he said, quote, "Our whole strength rests on the validity of that first vision. Mm-hmm. It either occurred or it did not occur. If it did not, then this work is a fraud. If it did, then it is the most important and wonderful work under the heavens." Now, Steve, the first vision has not always been the most important part of our church, but I feel like it's been stressed, especially the last couple decades. How has that happened? Why is it all or nothing for the first vision?
I wrote an article, as you may well know, about that, right? How the first vision became all or nothing,
right?
Raising the Stakes. It's available free online at BYU Studies, and it's a fascinating history,
it
right?
Is.
As you say, and as James Allen, another founding father of scholarly first vision studies, who recently passed away, a hero to me, a mentor to me, like Professor Bachman and Professor Bushman, as he showed in his research on the first vision, the earliest Latter-day Saints don't seem to be aware of the first vision, and to the degree that they may be, they don't talk about it as a catalyst in their belief. They don't cite it when they're saying, that's why I believe. So they cite the new covenant being restored, and the evidence of that being the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. That's how the missionaries approach them. So it'll be 1840, 42 before we start seeing published accounts of the first vision. And it'll be 40 years after that before it's canonized. And really, honestly, before the prophets are even talking about it in the way that we talk about it in the church today.
Right.
Well,
It's the first lesson for missionaries today.
Yeah, right. That's what a historian expects, is this kind of change over time. Now, if we're not a historian, or if we're not careful in our thinking, we bring assumptions to the table. We think, well, if there was a first vision, then Joseph Smith would have talked about it right then that day. It would have been in front page headlines in every newspaper in the land, and there would be records of it right then and there, and it would have been the basis of the church from day one. Well, none of those things is proved. They're just assumed. And there are plenty of good reasons to ask why. Why would we assume that? Why would we necessarily think that? Well, we would if we wanted to impeach Joseph Smith, right? If our goal was not to understand him and assess whether he had a vision or not, right? Sincerely seeking to know the answer to that question. If that's our starting point, we're going to listen to what he has to say. This is what Richard Bushman does. He listens really, really well to everybody from the past that he's trying to study, whether that's Muhammad or Jonathan Edwards or whoever, Joseph Smith. He treats them all with this kind of respect.
All right, I gotta call BS there. So what I just heard him say is, if you expect that between 1820, when Joseph Smith allegedly first saw God and Jesus, if you expect that between 1820 and 1832, he would have told anyone, that expectation is evidence that you're just trying to impeach or discredit Joseph Smith. I just heard him say that it's kind of ridiculously unrealistic to expect that in the 12 years after he saw the creator of the universe and his son, the savior of humankind, that he would have ever talked about it to anyone. Sandra?
Well, the reason we expect that is because in his 38 writing of his story, he says just shortly after having this experience, he's in the company of a Protestant minister and tells him supposedly of this vision. And this man told him that he didn't believe any such kind of visions happen today. And Joseph goes on to say, all these people came out against him everywhere. Everyone was opposed to him. No one would believe him that there were angels or God or anyone visiting people today. Joseph sets us up to expect that he was persecuted right from day one for telling this story. And the problem is, no one is aware of this story. For years, no one's aware of this story. If he was truly telling it far and wide to where it gave rise to all of this persecution against him, why isn't there any record of this? It isn't just that there isn't published accounts. There aren't journal accounts.
Well, we have records. That's the problem. We have records of people who are telling the story, like his mom, and she doesn't mention a first vision.
Yeah, well, but it's a later account. I mean, if we're talking about at the time, there aren't any contemporary journals of anybody, pro or con, writing down. I talked to Joseph today, and he told me this ridiculous story about seeing God and Jesus. I mean, there's just not that kind of criticism of him. When Alexander Campbell does his little article on Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon right after Mormonism starts, he doesn't raise the issue of a first vision account of God and Jesus. What he is opposed to is the idea of Joseph using a rock in his hat to bring out this new book of scripture. So if everyone was condemning Joseph for claiming this vision of God and Jesus, why didn't Alexander Campbell attack him on that point? It's the absence of any ministers saying they had this problem with him.
Yeah. Like, Dan, I'm curious to get you in here, but can you tell us, I guess Joseph Smith's mom would be the one, she wrote an entire book kind of retelling the Joseph Smith and the Mormon Church story from her perspective. What can you tell us about what she included in her own account, or didn't include? Maybe is more important.
Well, she evidently didn't mention it, and that when the book was published, Lucy's history was published, they just inserted Joseph Smith's 1838 account. So,
Wait. Can I just make sure I understood you? Are you saying that she writes a biography and then some external force inserts the 1838
yeah,
version of the first vision into her biography, even though that's stuff she didn't include herself?
right.
And it would make her story anachronistic too.
The story begins with the angel appearing in 1823.
What angel?
Well, later called Moroni.
Okay, so and again, the documents that we do have of what actually was happening in 1823, 1824, again, do they corroborate Lucy's version that she writes in her biography before some external force, external person with motives inserts the 1838 version into her biography? Does her story corroborate the extant evidence that we do have?
I didn't understand what you're driving at.
If you look at, like Sandra said, there's no record between 1820 and 1832 of Joseph telling anyone about his first vision.
Well,
are there records or evidence that support in 1823 or 1824 Joseph talking about an angel visiting him like his mother Lucy claimed in her biography?
Or the contemporary accounts of the angel appearing?
Yeah.
In 1823?
Yeah.
No. So it's very difficult to make an argument from silence. And the only way you can really make an argument of silence is if you have places where you expect it to be mentioned and it's not. So that would be there are newspaper accounts later that talk about Jesus appearing frequently, to Smith and other believers, and the Articles and Covenants of the Church of Christ in April or June, actually 1830, when the church was organized. The founding document, the Articles and Covenants, gives in the preface of that section. It's not a revelation, really. It's a document, founding document. It gives in chronological order the authority on which the church has been organized, and so it doesn't mention Peter, James, and John, or John the Baptist. So that would be an argument of silence right there for those accounts. It does mention the angel, later known as Moroni, appearing in conjunction with the Book of Mormon. And it alludes to an event in Joseph Smith's life where he received a manifestation of the forgiveness of his sins. So let's see if I can find it. For after that it was truly manifested unto this first elder, Joseph Smith, that he had received a remission of his sins. He was entangled again in the vanities of the world. But after truly repenting, God ministered unto him by an holy angel, which is Moroni. So there's an allusion to an event in Joseph Smith's life before the 1823 appearance of the angel, where he received a manifestation, whatever that was, not a vision. It could be a vision, but the manifestation could be many things. And so I have reconstructed Joseph Smith's early chronology, and I believe that he had a born-again experience like any other Christian at the time that attended revivals. And I based this reconstruction on the first chapter of the Book of Mormon, in the Book of Mormon, where Mormon gives a chronology of his life that matches up to Joseph Smith's pretty well, until it gets to Mormon saying, hold on a second. He says in his Mormon says that in his 15th year, he was visited of the Lord and tasted the sweetness of Jesus.
Interesting.
So both Mormon and Joseph Smith are named after their fathers. Both are large in stature. Both with their father moved with their fathers from the North Country to the land southward at about age 10 or 11.
I didn't know this.
Both their moves were followed by war with the Lamanite or Indians and a period of peace. Andrew Jackson's army defeated the Seminoles in 1817 and 18. Both lived in a time of apostasy. Mormon says he lives in a time of apostasy where there's no gifts or the Spirit. Both had a remarkable manifestation of Jesus at age 15. Both lived in a time where Gadianton robbers or secret combinations, slippery treasures, and magic were prevalent. So the Book of Mormon, I argue in my biography, 2004 biography, has a lot of autobiographical elements in it, most notably Lehi's family and Nephi being a representative, I believe, of Joseph Smith, and that he supports his father's visions. And Lehi even has a vision much like Joseph Smith Sr.'s, but a little different. It's a little different in very important ways that we won't discuss right now. But so my reconstruction is that there's no vision to talk about or report. He had a born-again experience, which is not very notable for anybody to take notice of. And so he was converted to Jesus, which in my family kind of dynamic interpretation of the Smith family, Joseph Smith Sr. was a Universalist, Unitarian, which holds that Jesus is the Son of God, only the same as anybody else being the son or daughter of God, and that there's only one God, and that's the Father. So Joseph Smith Sr., I argue that Joseph Smith converted to Jesus at a young age, was attracted to the Methodist faith, in the attended revivals in 1820, around there. The thing is that nobody's ever claimed that Joseph Smith couldn't attend a revival in 1820. He just didn't attend the revival that he described, which included the conversion of his mother and older siblings to the Presbyterian Church, which didn't happen until after Alvin died on November 19th, 1823. So we know that there was a revival, and this is where the historians agree with Wesley Walters. They don't disagree with him. The revival didn't happen in Palmyra in 1820. Okay, there's no dispute there. They just don't like it. And so the revival that Joseph Smith described was the 1824-25 revival, which Walters said that's what he's going to prove, that it was the 1824-25 revival that Joseph Smith described. And where it started with the Methodists, which is Reverend George Lane, who's an ancestor of mine, and Reverend Stockton implied that Alvin had gone to hell in his funeral sermon in 1823, and so Joseph Smith Sr. didn't want to go to that Reverend Stockton's church, but Lucy did, which made a division in the Smith family, much like the Lehi and Nephi family, over religion, over the meaning of Joseph Smith Sr.'s dreams. Joseph Smith Sr.'s dreams were that none of the churches were true, that they were all false. And Joseph Smith changed his vision to match his father's dream visions. So, well, maybe we'll get into more aspects of that later. Why did Joseph Smith? Here's the question. This is the question that Harper doesn't ask because he's too busy defending Joseph Smith and has a preoccupation with Wesley Walters and the revival, because they're still so stubborn they can't admit that they're wrong. So, what's the question? Why did Joseph Smith feel it was important to put the revival back in 1820? Why did he move the revival from 1824, 25 to 1820 to precede a vision story where he's told that none of the churches are true? Well, that's because Alvin died. The family was split over religion. And Joseph Smith was trying to resolve that by saying that Jesus told him that none of the churches were true. But he couldn't say that. Okay, I don't mean to hog the time, but the difference between the 1832 account and the 1838 account is that in the 1832, Joseph Smith had already decided all the churches were false from reading the Bible. And when he went to pray about it in 1832, he was only praying to know how could he be saved if there's no true church on earth. You know, if I can't go to a church and be baptized or commune with them, how can I be saved? And the vision, well, it wasn't a vision. It was a vision, but it wasn't a visitation. Okay, it was a heavenly vision. Joseph Smith looked into heaven, and the heavens were open, and he saw the Lord still in heaven. He never comes down in the 1832 count. Okay, so he's in heaven. He's speaking to Jesus in heaven. And Jesus tells him, all those who believe in me shall be saved. Sounds pretty Protestant, right? So that's how Joseph Smith was saved. It isn't until the Peter, James, and John story, the John the Baptist story, are introduced in the mid-1830s that Mormons have an exclusive claim on authority.
Salvation.
That too. But before that, they were the one in the true and living church of God on earth. Yeah, because they had the Spirit and apostles. So it isn't till Peter, James, and John and the priesthood exclusivity is introduced in the mid-1830s. That is why Jesus tells him none of the churches are true. Their creeds are an abomination. They're false. Don't join any of them, right? Because they can't baptize you. They can't save you. Whereas before it was just faith and the Spirit.
So let me try and summarize at least part of what I just heard. When Joseph, well, first of all, we've established that between 1820 and 1832, no one, not Joseph's dad, not his mom, not his siblings, not local pastors, no local newspapers, nobody wrote any account of him ever claiming to have had a conversation with God and Jesus, let alone being told to start God's one true church. That's including his own immediate family. Is that right, Sandra?
Yeah.
Okay. And then when he does write down an 1832 account, the substance of it is around how do people get saved? How do people who die, how do they get to go to heaven? And so when that is what he's thinking about, when that's a question that he's trying to answer in 1832, then he's talking to Jesus, because Jesus is the author of salvation. He's our savior. And he's saying, don't worry, we're all saved by me. And so that's what the 1832 account attempts to answer, is how people get individually saved, how Joseph individually got saved, and how other people can get saved too. Am I right so far?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there one more point is that at that time, Joseph believed that God and Jesus, God the Father and Jesus, were one. So, like, for example, when he's talking on the 32 account, Jesus says, Joseph, my son, you know,
Right.
and then talks as if he was Jesus who
Yeah.
was crucified for the sins of people.
So in 1832, he still believed that God and Jesus were the same being, which is also reflected in the Book of Mormon. That's also why it's just Jesus that he's talking to,
yeah,
not God and Jesus. What I'm hearing Dan Vogel say is by 1838, the church is trying to establish its authority as God's one true church. And, Joseph Smith's theology has evolved to now believe that God and Jesus are separate beings. And so when he recounts the 1838 version, those are two of the main changes, sort of changes in situations on the ground that then are what lead him to tell a totally different story. Am I kind of summarizing what I just heard Dan say?
Yeah. I'd also point out that one of the reasons for moving the story back before 1823 is that he has to have a religious experience before the angel comes to his room to tell him about the Book of Mormon.
And but I want you to continue that thought, but let me just ask you, are there accounts between 1823 and 1830 of Joseph telling people that an angel visited him? So we have no accounts of him claiming that God and Jesus visited him between 1820 and 1832. Are there accounts in 1823, 1824, 1825, 1826 of Joseph telling people that an angel visited him? Sandra.
Well, you have people that later give reminiscences of him telling them about the angel for the Book of Mormon.
That's what I mean.
I mean, they were not written in those years, but the people talk about that. That's what Joseph was saying in those years.
Wait.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Julia.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that they're in the Palmyra Freeman in 1829. He says that he was visited by God in a dream from the Almighty, and so that was, I think, one of the first versions of the angel story, where he was visited in a dream and then he was told where the plates were. But outside of those, like a few other things, I don't really think it was well published as far as before 1830 about the angel.
Okay.
But there were a few things. I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, I mean, Joseph had to tell people, if he's talking about golden plates, delivered by an angel and he's hiding them, he had to tell people something about prior to 1827 that he had some type of divine interaction.
Isn't there like a trial, because he was brought up for trial again because he was doing the peeping, but then Oliver says, "Oh, but this is done with the Urim and Thummim," and that was before 1830.
Yeah,
right.
I don't know. I hope you see what I'm asking, Sandra.
No. So the 1830 trial in July 1830 in South Bainbridge, and then following that in Colesville. That was kind of a retrial of the 1826 trial. Cowdery wasn't there, of course, because he didn't come until April 1829. Oh. But Cowdery testified in the court. They were trying to retry him in South Bainbridge, and he got out of that because of the statutes of limitations was up. And so then they rearrested him and took him down to Colesville. And it was Joseph Smith in the History of the Church says it was for preaching the Book of Mormon, but it was actually for using a seer stone to translate the Book of Mormon. And so Cowdery testified at that trial, according to A.W. Benton, 1831 account, that he didn't use the seer stone in translating, right? The stone in the hat thing. He used the spectacles that came with the plates.
Yeah.
And Benton says, well, isn't that just the same thing, in his account? And so that was the first time, that was the first untruth regarding the manner in which the Book of Mormon was translated. That became the official version, right? It was the spectacles, not the stone in the hat. And Joseph and Oliver followed that official version of the translation of the Book of Mormon, although it wasn't true.
Okay.
Cowdery never saw, he only saw the stone in the hat method, according to Emma Smith and Martin Harris. The spectacles were long gone before Cowdery came around.
If they ever existed. Sandra, I paused you in the middle of a point you were making.
No, I just that. Well, this gets back to how you combine memories. If he's going to tell about a revival that causes his mom and family to join the Presbyterians, that has to be an experience that happens after Alvin's death, because it's after Alvin's death that we have these ministers on the scene that imply Alvin went to hell. So the dad won't go to the revival meetings, but the mom and sister and brothers go, and they get converted to Presbyterianism, and Joseph decides that Presbyterians aren't true. But all of that has to be occurring in 24 or 25 or something. And so he's got to have a vision experience that predates the angel telling him about the Book of Mormon. Before Alvin dies, supposedly, according to Mother Smith, Alvin tells Joseph, be sure and get the book and finish the record. So you've already got the angel on the scene story, supposedly, before Alvin dies. But so when does Joseph go out to pray to get forgiveness of sins? You can't have him do it because of a revival in 24, because it makes it so late. It makes it past the whole revival experience. So if he had some sort of experience in the woods as a younger teen, then he could possibly hark back to that experience and think, oh, wait a minute, I could use that early experience as the launch of my career, and then marry this other part of the story later on with the 23 Alvin thing and the revival in 24 and the family coming into the Presbyterian Church at that time. But it doesn't fit for him to pray in 24 to know what church is true because of the revival.
And because the angel had already appeared.
It's
supposedly.
already had the
That's
angel
right.
vision in that. So the whole story gets confused if you try to marry the 1820 experience with the 1824 experiences.
Right. So the question of which church is true didn't come up in the Smith family until after Alvin's death. And that was an important time to solve the problem of which church is true, because Lucy was pressuring the family to join the Presbyterian Church. And Joseph Smith Sr. wouldn't do that because that was like denying his own dream visions, right? His dream vision says they're all false. And it wasn't just that he disliked Reverend Stockton for implying Alvin had gone to hell, because the Smiths didn't baptize their children. So in 1820, the 1832 account, the earlier account, is actually more accurate, even though it has an actual vision of Jesus in heaven anyway, rather than just being born again and being visited of the Lord in a way that is more like born again rather than a vision, an actual visitation. So the 1832 account is actually more accurate, which historians would grant that the 1832 account is more accurate. So the question of which church is true was answered by the Book of Mormon later, really. Or while he was talking to his family, he could have mentioned some religious aspects that answered some of their questions while the book was still in the hill. So the question is so important to Joseph Smith, to his development as a prophet later, that he puts the answer in 1820, but it's anachronistic.
Yeah.
It doesn't belong there.
That's something I wanted to point out as I'm thinking about it, because apologists need the first vision to have happened before 23. Like it needs to happen before Moroni. But then why would Lucy and a few kids join the Presbyterian Church after God and Jesus already told Joseph
that none of the
churches were true? Because apologists will acknowledge that Lucy joining the Presbyterian Church couldn't be before 23. I don't think there's any apologists out there saying that Lucy joined before 23.
Yeah.
They all make it after Alvin's death.
Yeah. It has to happen after Alvin's death.
Yeah. Because they're worried about Alvin's soul.
Right.
Right. And whether they're going to see him again. Right.
But if God and Jesus already told Joseph, you're going to restore the true church, because that's what apologists try to do. They try to merge all of the accounts and make it one.
Make them all true.
Right. Like make it so like he receives remission of his sins. He's also told that he's going to restore the true church, that none of the churches are true, and to not join any of them. So if you go by that and try to say that everything that Joseph said is true, then why is Lucy joining the Presbyterian Church years later?
Yeah.
And why did Joseph Smith try to join the Methodists in 1828?
And doing the treasure digging and being brought up to court for doing treasure digging and deceiving people.
Right. The problem with the Mormon apologetic for the first vision and this early, the way they're trying to reconstruct this is they're ignoring the larger picture of his life. It isn't just that we have 4 accounts that we've got to reconcile. You have to reconcile the whole history of everybody else around him, how they fit into the story. And it just doesn't work. I mean, the people around him that give the reminiscences, they aren't talking about hearing this first vision story. Their memories of what Joseph was talking about are very different than this later 1838 account. It doesn't fit with what we know from everybody else. The emphasis, the teachings that he's supposed to get from the vision, all are anachronistic to the setting of the church at that time period.
Winston, I just want to check in with you for a second. I know we probably should have just had you read the 1832 account and the 1838 account before you ask you to comment on this. But is it problematic for you if in the 1832 account he says the Lord visited him, but in the 1838 account, after he's developed a new theology that God and Jesus are separate, he claims in the 1838 account that God and Jesus both appeared to him in the flesh, right in front of him. Does that seem problematic to you or not?
I mean, it's definitely problematic, but at the same time, I could see apologists saying he didn't understand what he was seeing, right?
Mm.
Yeah.
That's exactly what they say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There is one point that we.
What about claiming that in response to a revival he attended, he went to God to ask which church was true in the 1838 account, but then we find out that there was no revival prior to 1820 when he claimed it happened.
They want to tie into different religious meetings and camp meetings and things that happened before 1820.
Apologists do.
But what they are not showing is that a revival like Joseph describes happened in 1820. What he describes happened in 1824.
Yeah. Does that seem suspicious to you, Winston? Or
Yeah, I mean, yeah, of course.
Okay.
It's not a very clear story at all.
Yeah. Not substantiated. Okay. All right. Let's
there's one point that we didn't address.
Go ahead.
And this actually conversation started because they talk about the first vision not being a pivotal story in Mormonism at the beginning of Mormonism. And I don't think we're going to have time to read them all, but if you go to Mormon Think, just look for the first vision. They have different quotes from Brigham Young, Orson Pratt, all of whom say that the Lord and God didn't come themselves to restore the church. that the restoration started with Moroni. And it's really clear that this first vision story was not the foundational story for Mormonism. And when, the first missionaries would go out to preach Mormonism, they would talk about Mormonism started with Moroni appearing, not God and Jesus.
Yeah.
Well, Harper admits that the emphasis of the first vision didn't really come in until 1880 time frame, because he talks about it being 40 years after the Joseph Smith time period of the printings of 1840 and 42 of the first vision story. And he says, and then 40 years later, before the church started emphasizing it, which would make it 1880. I mean, that's real late for this monumental vision to be talked about.
Yeah. Let's take a pause and just kind of read a few comments from our viewers and listeners. Thanks to Fred Lang for his support. I should put my glasses on for this. I'll read the next comment from Mark. Here are my glasses. The comment is from Mark Crispin. Thank you, Dan Vogel, Sandra Tanner, and the entire staff of Mormon Stories for everything you do each day. Our pleasure, Mark. Thank you for the support. My dear friend Brett Hutchins, who's always trying to get me to play basketball every Thursday night. He writes, hey, John, please use the super chat to take Sandra to lunch. So, Sandra, looks like a free lunch is in your future.
Oh, okay.
I'll play basketball with you, Brett.
All right. Winston says he'll play basketball. I have invited Winston. So anyway, Brett writes, take Sandra to lunch. I met her at her bookstore right before she retired. What an amazing woman. So glad that you continue to have her on the podcast. She's truly a treasure. Sorry, I believed she was a daughter of perdition for over 50 years. How does it feel to be a daughter of perdition? I guess.
Well, that's not a new title.
Thanks for that, Brett. And then finally, Ray Allen writes, to me, this is a moot point. If Joseph Smith was indeed a true prophet of God, the church he founded no longer remotely resembles what he restored and is now an apostasy. If he wasn't a prophet, then it's always been apostate. So he's basically saying the church is false either way, regardless of all this silliness about the first vision.
I actually agree with that a lot because, well, the other thing I was thinking about is that, as a Mormon watching like either like this video or the video we're reacting to, like you could easily start to think like, oh, well, if this is a reliable like account and like there's some way that these accounts could work, then, or if the accounts were good, then historians would agree with them more. But the truth is they could be the most consistent and like sensical things, and people, it still wouldn't be accepted that, the Mormon church, because it still doesn't make sense, even if the accounts were made any sense either.
If there was complete documentation
yes.
that was consistent and supported everything, it's still a little malarkey. Is that what you're saying, Winston?
Yes.
Okay. All
yes,
right.
there still are no horses in America, and tapers don't count.
Okay. All right. Now can we go to the video, Gerardo?
Let's do it.
All right. Let's go to the next clip.
Others, Dan Vogel or others, start from a different beginning point, and that is, I don't trust you at all. I know you're lying to me,
and I'm going to prove it.
I'm going to prove it. Yeah.
Whoa!
So depending on what you choose,
Dan Vogel, we got to stop there. You start, Dan Vogel, from the premise of Joseph Smith's a liar. Is that how you do history, Dan Vogel? You just got impugned or maligned there.
Yeah, well, I think the evidence shows that.
That you're a liar?
No, aren't those fighting words? Aren't those fighting words, Dan Vogel?
Yeah, well, I think the evidence shows that the Book of Mormon's not history. And if it's not history, then there was no angel. If there was no angel, there was no plates. There was no plates, there's no Nephites. Joseph Smith is telling I have just as much faith in that story as I do the ones he told when he was a money digger and things he saw in his stone two Indians fighting over each other and burying the treasure and killing one and throwing his body in with the treasure. All that stuff is make believe.
But what he's doing there, he's doing ad hominem there, isn't he? He's trying to malign
Oh,
your character and say, you, Dan, you're sitting around one day in your 20s and you're like, I need to prove this Mormon church is false because I'm a bad person. So I'm going to become a historian with the beginning motive to just show the world that Joseph Smith's a lying sack. Like, it seems like he's trying to discredit you there through ad hominem, but that's what I took from it. What did you take from it?
all I can hear is when he says that Dan Vogel knows his historical stuff.
That was good. Any other response to Stephen Harper maligning you?
Well, I'm so numb to it. After 40 years of, so is Sandra, I'm sure.
Have you been maligned? Have you been maligned, Sandra?
It has been rumored that I have been maligned. Yes.
Well, I like the response that, yes, the evidence shows that he is a liar. So I do believe that he's a liar. If you saw the evidence supporting that he's a liar, then you would start from believing he was a liar as well. Yeah. That's really what's important.
Well, I don't know about Dan, but I know my start did not start with Joseph's a liar. My start was, where's the evidence for the Book of Mormon? Because I believe it's really true. Not because I don't believe it's true, but because I believed it was true. I thought there would be evidence.
Yeah.
So,
and my start was like, I believed it my whole life. And then I was asked to teach seminary and I'm like, I want to brush up on my Mormon history. So let me learn more and deeper because it'll just reinforce my testimony more. It certainly was not, Joseph's a liar and let me prove it.
well, you look at all the people that have written into your programs through the years, time after time, it's someone that started out wanting to verify Mormonism, agonizingly looking for the evidence that it was true, hoping it would be true. They didn't want to lose their family. They didn't want to be disinherited. They didn't want to be cut off from their grandkids. They were forced to these conclusions because the evidence just isn't there. Right off the bat, there is no evidence for the Book of Mormon. There's no evidence for the Book of Abraham. Then what do you do with the rest of the story? If those two are not historical artifacts that he genuinely was working with, then of course we look at the story with skepticism.
Yeah.
It's painting this picture that people who are denying Mormonism are coming from a place of already not believing it, when a lot of Mormonism's greatest, I feel like, opposers are people who, had everything to lose by losing Mormonism and, were actively acting against their biases and wanting to seek confirmation of the religion.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to say in defense of yourself, Dan Vogel? You got a lot of explaining to do. Stephen Harper is making me question whether we should have even had you on the show, honestly.
Oh, okay. But that's an ad hominem, of course, and then Stephen Harper has to answer, why does he start from faith? How did he start? I started from faith and I ended up where I am at. But he started with faith before he even studied the first vision. So, but it really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where an argument or evidence comes from. You should focus on the argument. Is it a sound argument or isn't it? Is there evidence for this or isn't there? It doesn't matter. The person could be biased for whatever point of view you want to name and be right still, just accidentally pick the right side of the argument because his bias led him there. Who cares how he got there, or she? And it only matters the evidence that they're giving you for their belief. It doesn't matter if they're biased or not. It's irrelevant.
Yeah, and if we're going to be maligning motives, of all of us here, what could be Stephen Harper's bias? He probably has a 6-figure salary, with really good benefits, a career and a really good pension and his entire reputation coming from the church, right? And so, like, if we want to play that game, I think he's going to lose if we play that game, right? Because he's literally on the church's payroll. Am I wrong, Dan?
Well, this is one of the flaws of Mormon historians. They'll go, "Oh, that's a enemy of Joseph Smith's. You can't believe what they say," and so they only believe a fellow believer back in 1830s what they say, but the believers are just as biased as the non-believers. But historians have ways of working through bias in accounts.
Yeah,
and
you look at the evidence.
using multiple accounts and which one has the most credibility. So just because what they're setting themselves up for, they're building a paradigm, a circular system of thought that only verifies itself and has no way of ever introducing negative evidence or disconfirming evidence. You, by definition, you block out whole categories of testimony.
Yeah, it's a convenient ploy. All right, well, now that he's maligned you, let's go ahead and continue with the video.
What Professor Bushman calls the hermeneutic of trust or the hermeneutic of suspicion, you arrive at a different place. Now, the important thing to notice is they both use the same body of facts. They both have access to the same historical record. The documents are the same. One of them doesn't have a pile of evidence that the other one doesn't know about. And so the determinant here is what you're going to decide the facts mean. It's really like the glass half full or half empty example, right? You can see the exact same facts. There are 4 accounts, primary accounts of the first vision. They give versions of the story that are not precisely the same over time. They change over time. And you could decide to interpret that in a variety of ways, believing ways and unbelieving ways.
Right.
And it's not satisfactory to simply say, well, you're dumb if you treat it believing or unbelieving, right? The people who are not believing are not dumb. They're well informed, right? I share a completely different reading of the accounts than Professor Ann Taves does, but she is a phenomenally brilliant scholar who knows all the same evidence I do. That is to say, really well-informed people can come to different conclusions about this evidence. It's not the evidence itself that is the determinant of belief or not.
Right.
You have to decide whether you're going to approach these things with faith in God and Christ and that they pick Joseph Smith or not.
Right.
I really want people to understand that. There's a thought out there that if you just knew the evidence, you wouldn't believe. And alternatively, if you just knew the evidence, you'd be forced to the conclusion of belief.
Right.
Neither one of those is true.
Yeah. Right. I think it's important, we talk about this often, is triangulating the evidence.
Right.
And in my opinion, when we're talking about religious, spiritual things, one of those things that we should triangulate the evidence with is the Spirit.
It has to be that way. How can you know whether Joseph Smith is telling the truth about seeing the Father and the Son in the woods of Western New York unless the Father or the Son reveals that to you? You cannot know it.
Right.
You can know what he says about it. You can believe that you've disproved it because you've amassed these facts. That's not the same as knowing one way or the other.
Right.
You can bring the historical method to bear. Reverend Wesley Walters did this in the 1960s. Right? He's a Presbyterian minister. And for him, there's an immense amount at stake. As you know, the manuscript history account of Joseph's vision says, Mom, I learned for myself Presbyterianism isn't true. Well, Presbyterianism means the world to Wesley Walters, right? He's a young man who feels like he is going to hell forever. He grows up in a Baptist context and he hasn't had the experience of being born again in Christ. And then he goes to a revival and the Reverend Donald Barnhouse speaks and gives this wonderful analogy about how Christ's saving work occurs in our lives. And Reverend Walters, then a young man, teenage Wesley Walters, is filled with the spirit of it. He gets the experience he had longed for. Well, for the rest of his life, he's going to defend that, right? And I don't doubt any of that. I think that's the greatest thing, except that there's another step beyond that. I think the restoration adds to that. And so I feel similar with Joseph Smith, right? This is the version of the gospel, the restored version is the one that does the work in my life that the Reverend Donald Barnhouse's version of the gospel did for Wesley Walters. All this means that I can sympathize very much with Wesley Walters when he says, I am going to dig through every archive, every Methodist newspaper, every report of any kind of camp meeting I can to show that there was no unusual religious excitement on the subject of religion in Joseph's region when he said there was. And if that didn't happen, then the vision didn't happen.
Right.
So that was his case. He thought it was proved. In some ways, it seems proved, but not if you keep digging,
Right.
which Professor Bachman did.
Mm-hmm.
And Professor.
All right, let's go ahead and pause there. I think that's a good place to pause. Any comment, Dan or Sandra, you want to make about his comments about Wesley Walters, his motives?
Well, first off, Wes was a Presbyterian minister, and yes, he'd tell you about his born again experience of coming to Christ. But to try to make his research as just a response to defending his denomination is a great disservice to Wes's historical inquiry. Now, Wes and I belong to different denominations, and yet Wes was not hammering me all the time to be a Presbyterian. Wes was not that motivated on the basis of trying to defend his church. He was trying to defend Christianity in that he felt Mormonism was a great disservice to the Christian message because he saw Joseph Smith as truly leading people astray with a false gospel. But to emphasize that, well, he was upset because Joseph claimed Presbyterian isn't true, is to belittle Wes's serious historical research. Wes was a very accommodating person to everybody doing research. And I know that Dan would have experienced this as well. It didn't matter what you believed. Wes would share his research with anyone. He was a historian at heart. It wasn't just to defend his church.
Okay. Dan, anything you want to add about Wes Walters?
Oh,
and then I
yes,
have a follow-up
yes.
point.
Wes had a lot of integrity when it came to making his arguments for his point of view. And his research on the first vision stands still. They have not moved what he discovered. They might say, well, no, in the country, in the region of district of country or whatever, it's a larger area. So it wasn't just in the place where we lived, and that's completely wrong because Joseph Smith's account says it's in the place where we lived. There was an unusual excitement on the subject of religion, priest contending against priest and convert against convert, and goes on and on. Well, the place where they lived was Palmyra. And like I said before, the 1824 revival matches. It began with the Methodists in Palmyra, and it spread to the other denominations. There was a large, people were added to all the various churches. Converts filed off to one church or the other. And so Wes's research still stands. They have an apologetic maneuver they like to take, to try to get out of that problem, but it's not convincing at all. Okay. So, and it's very sad to see the younger generation like Harper follow in Bachman's footsteps, because his apologetic was really very amateur. And so let me tell you my story about my encounter with Milton Bachman. So I was, very in my early, shortly after my mission, and I was doing research at BYU, and I had read Wes's and the exchange between Wes Walters, Bachman, Bushman's thing. And let me show you this. This is Wes's new light on Mormon origins from the Palmyra, New York revival. This is how he published it to begin with. This is the little pamphlet published by Arthur Bud Varson, 1967. And his research in this little pamphlet was republished in the Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought. And Bushman responded to it, and it was pathetic. So, and I was still a believer. Okay, I was still somewhat of a believer, still wrestling with how I was going to come down on this. And so I was researching in the library, and Milton Beckman comes in and sits in the table right in front of me. Okay, so I decided, well, and I heard I didn't know him by sight at this point. And the person said, mentioned his name when they brought materials to him in this. We were in the special collections part of it. And I said, "Oh, Beckman." Oh, and I struck a conversation with him. And we went back and forth on the first vision. And I said, well, I can't remember the details of it after, 35 years probably. And Beckman would say, give his spiel, his apologetic. And I said, well, Walters says this about that. What do you have to say about it? And he would come back, and I go, well, that, we went back and forth, and until finally he goes, what'd you say your name was? he says, you sure know your stuff. And I said, well, I think I'm a believer still, I'm a believer, but I still think we need to be honest about who is winning this debate. So that's my experience. And that's kind of how I worked my way out of the church in a way.
Yeah. My biggest problem with kind of this little segment is Harper seems to be saying, okay, there's facts. The facts are out there. We're all working for the same facts. And, some people who have disbelieving, motives to malign Joseph Smith, they're going to end up as non-believers and as critical historians. But then if you have a faithful hermeneutic and you just simply want to believe, you're just as reasonably going to end up as a believing historian. And he talks about that as if the facts don't really determine where someone ends up. The facts are just the facts, and you could go either way, and the facts support any conclusion equally. Faith or non-faith is simply a matter of choice, whether you just choose to be a positive, shiny, happy, full of light believer, or a dark, critical, cynical, skeptical non-believer. But the facts, could put you either way. And I don't think that's fair. I think you look at the facts, they really do point in one direction. And so I think it's kind of a sleight of hand when he makes it sound like belief or non-belief is simply a matter of choice. It's just you choose to believe or you choose not to believe. And then there's the facts.
But he also wants to say, like, all these researchers, Fawn, Brodie, and Walters, those are old researchers, but there's this new, like, Beckman apologist who has found new evidence, and all of that is resolved, so we don't have to worry about it.
I was going to say pretty much exactly what you said. Like, he's painting this picture of like, well, I'm really smart, I'm a scholar. I know all the facts, and I know a lot of people, and pretty much, it's 50-50, I understand why they don't believe it, but, I know everything and I do believe it, they're smart, I'm smart. So you don't even, it's almost like devaluing like evidence and like learning, because it's like, well, us who know everything, it's like, it's still 50-50. So and it's just because, trust me, because I said so,
And I don't think the evidence leads us with 50-50.
Yeah,
that's what I'm trying
it's
to
not
say.
even close. Yeah,
it is not a 50-50 proposition.
Yeah.
There is so much of Smith's story, so much of Smith's product of his scriptures that absolutely can be shown to be modern inventions and not ancient history, that of course it leads one to doubt the rest of his story, where there may not be as much evidence. You of course approach it more skeptically when you see major parts of his story obviously don't check out. I mean, the book of Abraham itself is so obviously not what he claimed it to be, that then yes, historians are going to be a little more careful in looking at the rest of what he says. If you know at certain times, absolutely, the evidence comes down on the side against him, then people are going to be more skeptical on the whole picture.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you really think about it, it's not just whatever evidence we can find around the first vision. It's the fact that the church hid versions of the first vision from us. What does that tell us? Basically, in effect, lied to us about it. But then you add to that his treasure digging, his running afoul with the law, the fact that the first vision story changes over time. But then you've got the Book of Abraham and the Kinderhook plates and the, Joseph Smith revision of the New Testament and the invention of the Melchizedek priesthood late and the copying of the Masonic Lodge temple ceremony into the Mormon temple ceremony, and the fact that he's propositioning 14-year-olds for sex and 16-year-olds and mother-daughter pairs and sister pairs. And the list just goes on and on and on. It would just seem that a historian, even employed by the church like Stephen Harper, would acknowledge that this is a real uphill battle, not some sort of 50-50 question that any reasonable person could sort of choose to go either way, but they don't do that. And, part of that has to be because of who signs his paycheck. All right. Should we go to the next clip?
Wait, no, hold on.
All right.
Maybe he could believe it. It might not be that he's.
No, for sure. But there is that Upton Sinclair quote that it's impossible to get a man to see a point of view when his livelihood depends on not seeing it.
Yeah.
But you're right. I'm not saying he's not a sincere believer.
Yeah. I mean, it's not literally impossible. I'm just saying, we want to, be good faith and believe that he actually believes what he's saying and not just, saying because he, is paid to.
Yeah. I'm not saying he's lying, but I'm saying that there would be really steep consequences if he were to change his belief.
Like very highly motivated to believe the things that it would be catastrophic if he lost faith.
Yeah. Tell me about it. Okay. Let's go ahead and go to the clip.
Allen and Richard Anderson and Richard Bushman. So Truman Madsen, philosophy professor at BYU, was sort of heading up a special issue of BYU Studies and other efforts to respond to Wesley Walters. They actually had a pretty fun exchange at Southern Illinois University. They were both attending an event there, and Professor Madsen sees Wesley Walters' name tag, and he said, "Wesley Walters, you're the one who dropped the bomb on BYU. They're giving us all the money we need to respond to you," right? They have this pleasant exchange. And so Professor Bushman, right off winning the Bancroft Prize, the ultra prestigious prize for an American historian, is invited to respond to Wesley Walters, which he does in his characteristic style, with charity, with a thoroughly informed response, and with critical analysis that's really hard to impeach. And so that's the way this conversation has been going for well over 50 years now. And people who know the exact same evidence thoroughly come down on different sides. They interpret the evidence to mean different things. And I interpret it to mean that Joseph Smith was picked by Jesus Christ to be his servant. But before that, he was told, "Joseph, my son, your sins are forgiven." He was an angsty teenager thinking that Presbyterianism was probably right, which meant that he felt a lot like Wesley Walters did as a teenager, like that salvation boat had passed him right by.
Right.
And Joseph longed for Methodism to be right because that would mean he had a chance. He could affect salvation in Christ by sort of willing himself to receive God's grace. Whereas at the time, the Presbyterian version was God has already decided that, and there's nothing. It's his inscrutable sovereign will, and there's not a thing you can do about it. So Joseph hoped Methodism was right, but he thought that probably Presbyterianism better fit his lived experience. And he had to know. He had to know. And that's why he went to the woods. And the vision taught him that neither one of these versions has it exactly right, but you are forgiven of your sins. And I'll make the fullness of the gospel known to you at some future point. I believe that. I believe Joseph tells me the truth. Now, a person would say, and I would say, why? Why do you believe that? What's at stake here? What are your motives, right? Are there prejudices you're trying to deal with here? Are there things what's the psychological component of this? And I think everybody ought to ask themselves those questions. Everybody ought to think critically and carefully, but thinking critically and carefully does not mean coming to the conclusion that it didn't happen. That often is a result of not thinking terribly critically or very carefully about it, and maybe not examining your own motives and intentions.
Right. Thanks, love.
think slow so you know how you know what you know.
Right. So
Really quickly, is it true that that Richard Bushman's work on Joseph Smith is unimpeachable?
Well, I don't think so.
Huh?
I don't think so.
Wes impeached it, and the Tanners published it.
What do you
Yeah.
mean?
He responded.
He responded to Bushman.
Yeah.
He wrote a response. He impeached it. Bushman was doing the apologetic thing. I mean, he did a scholarly job of it, but still, it was off the mark. It was just way off the mark.
Maybe he means Rough Stone Rolling and not
No, he means like
Bushman's 70s work.
he meant the
Dialogue.
direct response. Yeah.
Yeah, the dialogue. So when they republished this in Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought, which I have up there on my shelf, then Bushman wrote a response, and Wes wrote a rejoinder to Bushman right in Dialogue. But even after that, Wes wrote a response to all of the critics of his First Vision research.
Well, you have Signature Books printing Wes Walters' book with Mike Marquardt, Inventing Mormonism. And Wes gives a recounting of the problems of the First Vision there, and of the revivals and the retelling of the story and the events that would have to have happened for the 1820 version to be acceptable. So Wes laid it all out, even as late as in Inventing Mormonism, which was printed about 1991 or so. It was Wes had died before the publication actually came out in print, but he lays out his case even that late in the 1990 timeframe.
Okay.
Yeah, I was misspoke when I said the Tanners published his response to Bushman. It was to Dr. Clandestine on the First Vision, which was Mike Quinn, and then subsequently Mike Quinn published a really long, irrelevant tirade on it. It totally pissed me off because he kept repeating this footnote about Walters trying to make him appear dishonest because he should have known this or that. And it just irritated me because he kept repeating it in the footnotes, this accusation against Wes. But it was Quinn. I responded to Quinn in my 3 videos, and it's Quinn that's way off on a lot of stuff. He tries to move the revival to June of 1820, June, okay, in the summertime, because there's an account in the Palmyra newspaper that there was a revival out on the outskirts of Palmyra, but then I reminded him of there's an added part to Joseph Smith's account that in the handwriting of Willard Richards added, like I think it's note A or B or C, I can't remember which, in 1840 or 42, Willard Richards, Joseph Smith dictated a part that he came home and he leaned up against the hearth and told his mother that he learned that Presbyterianism isn't true. So, and then Harper here seems to go on about Joseph Smith being attracted to Presbyterianism, but no, he was inclined towards Methodism because it's the revival and the spirit and all that kind of stuff. And Presbyterianism is more conservative type of revivals that they had.
Yeah.
Not as wild as the Methodists.
Let me just ask, is any of Richard Bushman's work on Joseph Smith that any of you know of, Sandra or Dan, has any of his work on Joseph Smith received accolades? Like, do his peers at Columbia or Harvard or Yale or wherever, are they like, wow, Richard, your work on Joseph Smith, Ruston Rolling, that was groundbreaking? Or is it more a book written either to faithful Mormons or to help people investigating Mormonism give Joseph a faithful look? Do we know if Richard Bushman's Joseph Smith scholarship has deep respect amongst secular academic peers?
Well, I think he has respect.
No, I mean his work on Joseph Smith.
Well, they wouldn't know enough to know
Yeah,
how
they
to
wouldn't.
evaluate his work.
Who would care what they thought anyway?
What do you mean? What do you mean?
Non-Mormons don't know what they're talking about. even
No, they mean
even
there's
Jan Taves, or Ann Taves, excuse me. Ann Taves is a non-Mormon, and they all try to come to the Mormon meetings and contribute some special thing but I've never been terribly impressed with non-Mormon historians. Mormon historians, they have, an advantage over the non-Mormon who comes at it. They sometimes give a contribution that's interesting, but it's far and few between that, in my experience. I prefer even the most biased Mormon historian like Bushman to a lot of the non-Mormons who come and try to contribute.
Interesting. I can just imagine like some historian writes about William Shakespeare or Emily Dickinson. There's going to be other people who aren't necessarily experts in Emily Dickinson or Shakespeare, but who know the time period and who read historians and other figures and just know enough about the time period and care enough about the time period or about the subjects at hand, where they would be able to say, well, this is great history, or this is, or they would just ignore it. And you're basically saying, if you're not really a Mormon historian or an ex-Mormon historian, your opinion about Bushman's writings around Joseph Smith really would be ill-informed to begin with?
Would be ill-informed, yes.
Okay.
So Bushman, though, is regarded highly for his biography of Benjamin Franklin. I think Harper said someone else, but and he has a history on the New England Puritans, I think, that's regarded quite highly. Now, I liked a lot of parts of Rough Stone Rolling. I mean, it's a 1-volume thing. It had some apologetic stuff. Bushman is an apologist, but he came to a lot of the similar position as I have on the Smith family dynamics. And I think he came to them independently because he has had some training in psychology. For all the criticism Fawn Brodie received for being a psychobiographer, Bushman did a similar thing with Benjamin Franklin. And
I didn't know Bushman wrote a biography on Benjamin Franklin.
Yeah, so he told me that he's learned the weaknesses of doing psychobiography from that. But his is a full, his Brodie's wasn't too psychological. I mean, it's very Freudian, okay. And I came at it more of a family systems approach, family dynamics, kind of a sociological study of the family. That's kind of how I describe it. Rather than Freudian and psychoanalysis. And
right.
I did delve into looking into psychobiographies and Freudian methods, and I just was not impressed with that method. So I didn't use it, even though I kind of, here and there, you can't do psychology without a little bit of understanding of Freud. Anyway, so, but Bushman, I like Bushman. I even like Harper. I think Harper is probably a wonderful teacher there at BYU. I just disagree with him. See, he's talking about disagreements, but he admits his bias. And it's typical among Harper and other apologists just to say everybody's biased. They're like levelers, you know what I mean? Like, they want everyone's biased equally, you know, and so, and then you get into Kerry Muhlestein in the Book of Abraham, and he says, I just let my bias free, you know, and I just interpret everything according to the gospel, and I feel I'm justified because that's what everybody has biases, and that's just, you're supposed to try your best not to do it, but you can't triangulate with the Spirit. What is that? We need to triangle with the Spirit. I mean, you can't pray to resolve historical problems. Prayer is not one of the methods. And if you're going to be a historian, that's a game. Okay, you have a certain game, certain rules. You got to stay there, or else you have no credibility. If you try to fudge things because you have a testimony, and they're going to bear their testimony here at the end if we get that far. I have a testimony, they say, of the first vision. Really? You do? I mean, and therefore I know it, God and Christ appeared to Joseph. You don't know that.
I would say that if you were a Mormon listening to this program and you wanted to read the best Mormon defense of Joseph Smith, that I would say read Rough Stone Rolling by Richard Bushman. I think it's the best the Mormon apologists can do. I don't think it covers the problems, though. And I think that many people read Bushman and come away realizing it sounds like there's more to the story. And I've talked to many people that have left Mormonism after reading Bushman. Not that that was Bushman's intent, but they end up realizing that there was a lot of apologetics and special pleading along the way in Bushman's account. So, but for a Mormon, I think that's your best bet. If you want to try to reconcile things, go read Bushman.
Got it.
But if you want to get a little closer to scientific history, try Vogel or Brodie.
Got it. All right. I hear that Turley is working on a biography of Joseph Smith. And he's got like 10 years of funding to write a biography on Joseph Smith. You're rolling your eyes, Sandra. Why are you rolling your eyes?
Well, because I think he's too much of a believer to write an objective story.
Yeah. Yeah. Dan?
Well, I don't expect an objective story. I want them to write really the best biography that they can. But if the saints' history is any indication, we can't set our sights too high with our expectations too high on that. But yeah, he has like an army of researchers. Even Brian Hales and his new wife are on the working for Turley to write this biography and looking to get sources and things.
I'm just dying to know what new light Richard Turley is going to shed on Joseph Smith. I mean, maybe he'll find something really interesting and groundbreaking, but
well, I think all you can do is bring new interpretation to the facts that are already out there. I don't know how much new material can actually be brought forward.
Unless the church has been hiding more stuff and they're finally going to give it to him. But he's going to get 10 years and an army of research support to write a new biography. Like, that's interesting. All right, let's keep going with the video.
So, Steve, how many accounts of the first vision were there?
What we know of is 4 that came to us from Joseph Smith or someone he was working closely with. So he worked very closely with Frederick Williams in the late summer or fall of 1832 to give us this 6-page autobiography, a history of the life of Joseph Smith and the marvelous things that Jesus does through him. It's an awesome little record, raw and rough from Joseph's perspective and a modern reader's, but also beautiful and profound. And it's our earliest one that we have, mostly written in his own hand. 3 years later, he's giving a spontaneous account of the vision to a visitor from New York, and his scribe captures a version of it in Joseph's journal. So November 9th, 1835 journal entry gives us an account of the vision. The next one, he's going to start in 1838 before the saints are exterminated from Missouri, but then he's going to go through that Liberty Jail experience before he sits down again and revises and captures it in the version we have today, which is in his manuscript history book A1, and it's excerpted for us in the Pearl of Great Price. That's the one that's most commonly known. And then the fourth of the four that we get from him during his lifetime is a letter to John Wentworth, a newspaper editor in Chicago, where Joseph responds to his invitation to furnish primary evidence that Wentworth's friend could use to write a history of New Hampshire. We don't have the letter Joseph sent to Wentworth, but they published it. The Saints published it in their own newspaper in the Times and Seasons. So we have that version of it. It's short. It's designed for a kind of a public consumption for an audience. It's designed to do PR work. The manuscript history one is very much characterized by the violent persecution that the saints are suffering. It's as if Joseph is saying, where did this persecution start? Oh, it started when I was an infant almost. It started the minute that I told the minister about my vision, and he slammed me. So he's looking back on his life in this particularly combative present, and he finds this moment of bitter persecution. So that one is understandably and very interestingly the most intense and most shaped by the persecution the saints suffer in Ohio and especially in Missouri. A few years later, when things are at a comparative lull, the Nauvoo Charter is making things safe. Joseph revises that account, interestingly, and he cuts out a lot of that intense persecution part, right? The whole beginning, owing to the many reports put in circulation by evil disposed and designing people, he just cuts that off and says, I was born in Sharon, Vermont.
Right. Let's make it a little bit more peacemaker.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we all remember our past in the present. That people might say, duh. Well, thank you, Professor Harper. What a Captain Obvious.
Right.
But there's a lot of implication to that. We don't store memories intact, autobiographical memories. We make them up right here, right now. We make them out of what Harvard psychology professor Daniel Schachter calls traces. Nobody knows quite what to call this stuff or how to describe it or even where it is. But we have these pieces at our disposal. And when we need to make a memory, we take those things that we've stored from past experience and we mix them with our present situation and context, our present purposes and prejudices and so forth. And we create the memory right there in real time. That's why it's fascinating to study these memories from 1832, 35, 38, 39, 1842. They are combinations of what Joseph experienced in the Grove and what he was experiencing at the time he did the remembering. And that's the best way to look at them and to learn why they say what they say and how they work the way they work, and what they're doing, what they're for. So
right. And as a matter of fact, if he said it word for word the exact same every time, it would seem as if it was more of a fictional story, one that he's created. And I need to remember point A and point B and point C, and this is my point, and blah, 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 whatever. And it's different every time. Tell us why that's okay. Why is it not a bad thing that it's different every time? Well,
you're on to a great question here. Why would I assume that it is bad, that it's different every time, right? You're noticing that people who make that claim are asserting a premise that is far from proved. What if we did that with the resurrection accounts of Jesus? Well, we'd have to reject it.
Right.
What if we did it with the accounts of Saul converting? We'd have to reject that ever happened. What if we did it with Alma the Younger? And what if we did it with our own lives, right? You could take anybody out there who was willing and honest and open, and you could survey them about the most important past experience of their life. And you could ask them, you could interview them over time, or you could have them sort of tell it in various spots and different ways over the course of a year. And you would get something very similar to the first vision accounts of Joseph Smith. This is the way people remember. His accounts are not anomalous. They're characteristic. They're typical of the ways people remember. Stephen Prothero, very highly regarded religion scholar at Boston, this is what he said. This is what he concluded in his book about American Jesus is your very point there, right? People are hypercritical of these accounts of Joseph, but those people are not typically historians or lawyers who are used to working with various accounts from people of the same experience and realize you can expect variation. You can expect difference. And it does not necessarily follow they lied to me flat out. There may be things they got wrong. There may be distortions. It would be shocking if there are not memory distortions. That's not the same as lying or getting it wrrong.
Me and my friends were.
All right, so let's go ahead and just address that. He's basically saying memory is, memory is constantly evolving. We're mixing what we stored with what we retrieve, with what we're experiencing in modern day. Joseph's changes in those 4 primary accounts of the first vision are pretty much just like any any way that any of us would retell any story that we experience over time. In fact, it would be weird if there weren't changes in the accounts. In fact, it's almost a testimony to the truthfulness of Joseph Smith's accounts, the fact that they change. And if it were more consistent, that would be more of a cause to be suspicious than the evidence lays out. So basically, we should have more faith that these stories change than actually doubt them more.
Well, and if you look at the last 2 accounts of the first vision they want to mention, the one that's now printed in the Mormon scriptures, and then compare it with the Wentworth letter, which are both things that are published in the 1840s. Yes, there are differences, but not of substantial major differences. They would fit into the kind of framework where he's talking about, I'm not going to emphasize so much the persecution thing at the start, or let's tone that down or whatever. Yes, that's what you expect in different tellings of the same story. But how do you reconcile that with the 1832 account? These are so radically different that I don't think that idea works with the 32 account. We're talking about a radically different story in 32 than the 1842 account that gets printed in the Times and Seasons. I mean, if you're going to say he has later concerns that he puts back into the story, then how do we know what really happened at the original event? So am I to then say, oh, well, he could have had Jesus show up and tell him his sins are forgiven, and the other parts are later additions and weren't really part of his experience. When are they going to make this idea of the Father and Son having physical form? When does that concept come into the story? Was it there at the beginning, or is this one of these later things that he folds into his memory? It just doesn't add up to try to dismiss the problems that way.
One of the most condemning things, I think, in this whole story is not only does Joseph Smith's version of his first vision change along with his evolving theology from 1832 to 1838, but the Book of Mormon itself, the text of the Book of Mormon, changes along with both Joseph Smith's evolving theology about God and with the changes in the first vision. So you've got Joseph Smith's theology about God and Jesus evolving, and both his first vision story and the Book of Mormon, the text of both, change along with his changing
and the
theology.
revelations, because I think after 35 he never had revelations where he kind of mixed the identity of Jesus and the Father. Before 35 he was doing that in the revelations. Is that right? Did I get that
he's
right?
Changing the revelations. He's also changing things in his translation of the Bible as he's evolving his idea of God. The changes he makes along the way show an evolution of his theology. There isn't this concept from day one of the Father and Son being 2 separate physical beings. It just isn't in the early record of Mormonism. It's a later addition.
Dan, what do you want to add to this part of the conversation? Anything?
So, I mean, no one's going to argue that memory can change over time. But at what point do you say that it's changed too much and it's evidence that the person has impeached themselves? I mean, in court of law, if you gave this as an excuse every time, you'd never be able to prove anything. And so you'd never catch anybody. I doubt if he uses the same principle when his children come to him with excuses and lie or change their story. You changed your story. I bet he doesn't do that in real life. He only does it as an apologetic tool. So it's a true principle. This would be a fallacy of principle, meaning it's a true principle, but misuse. It's a misuse of a true principle. Does this principle translate to an apologetic device? And behind it all is an assumption that the vision was real. So he's begging the question. I mean, he's already assumed what he's trying to prove. And it just comes out as an excuse. And then John's point was right on point, because you have these things changing along with the first vision. It's just not a memory thing. You can show that there's a design behind the change. I mean, did he pray? Did he go and pray about which church was true, or didn't he? Did he forget when he told it in 1832 that he prayed to ask which church was true, and did he forget that and then just make up something on the spot that said that he already knew the churches were false and he was just praying for his own salvation? You know, did he? What did Jesus tell him not to join any of the churches, or did Jesus tell him that he was already saved? You know, through faith. So they're diametrically opposed to the 1832 account. The other ones, you know, small details, sure, could be added and subtracted or whatnot. So I just think he begs the question. He assumes that it's a real vision. And really, in the end, does it matter that if there was a true vision or not? I mean, we can't retrieve that vision. We can only go according to what Joseph Smith told, and he changed the story. And that's all you know. You can't make, you don't know that he's misremembering, or you can't tell if he's misremembering or intentionally changing the story to suit his own purposes at the time, which, you know, what does it really matter if it was there was a real story behind it or not? We can't really get a history except through the stories that were told. So he mentioned this himself, that you want to find, this is what historians do. I mean, we can reconstruct the past, but we can't prove it like you do in science. You can't have a theory and then prove it. You can only reconstruct the past. It's totally lost forever. And when you reconstruct it, you're looking for the reconstruction that is the most defensible among all the others. And I would maintain that Harper's reconstruction is not the most defensible. The most defensible is the one we've been discussing, that there is an evolution, which then bears fruit by what John mentioned about it going along the same line as Joseph Smith's theology. So it all ties in, and you can, once you're honest about the evidence and the contradictions, and these contradictions lead you to interpretations, this is how you discover and reconstruct the past, that there's a development and why there's a development. And this tells you about who Joseph Smith really is, what he's thinking. That's all we can know, is what he's thinking, and his thinking is changing. And there seems to be a reason for this thinking changing. This is a more defensible reconstruction than Harper's.
Yeah. Winston, I just want to sanity check with you really quick. So let's just say they're saying there's 4, but I think there's up to 9 different versions, depending on how you count, right?
He's
Right.
original, so he must be counting all the ones that branch off of the 1838 as 4 main ones.
Yeah. And so I remember reading like the differences between all the different 9 accounts. And Winston, I'm just going to ask you, in your opinion, if you were to find out that between the 9 accounts of Joseph Smith telling his story, his age changes from 14 to 15 to 16. It's anywhere between 14, 15, and 16 as a first thing. Now, he's remembering back to when he saw the creator of the universe and the savior of mankind, or not. or just Jesus. Either way, how problematic is that for you that he can't get his age right?
Well, and I mean, yeah, it's pretty problematic.
It is?
Yeah, this is like coming out like like over a decade later though, right?
Yeah.
So, you could say like, that's a detail where as an apologist, it could be explained by like memory loss. Like it feels like the whole like, memory is like imperfect thing. It is an explanation for some differences, but there are like very important more pressing differences that it just can't begin to explain, like that. Memory changes over time or something.
I would just say that the problem is that it's not an isolated event. So there was a lot of things happening during that decade. Moroni coming 4 times or 3 times or whatever, him retrieving the plates and like receiving instruction by Moroni, and the first vision happening before that. So it's kind of like the same thing as when like it's not hard for me to know when I received the Aaronic priesthood, because I know that happens at 12, and when I got the Melchizedek priesthood, I know that happens at 18, and it happens several years later. So I think if it was an isolated event that's kind of small and insignificant that happened at 12, and I'm telling it 10 years later, I guess I would agree with that. But since there's a lot of things that are going on around that, it's hard to, I don't know. To me, it's a bigger deal.
Yeah,
Like,
if it was just that he forgot his age or something, and like, and that like, he said it was one age and then it was another, I wouldn't like, that wouldn't be like super like damning, like, oh, that could never be true. He said he was 10, but he was 11, but it's like, there's a million, it feels like there's so many things that are wrong with the story that it's like hard to explain. And I really liked what Dan said about like the court of law. Like if this was a court and this guy was a judge, like are you like giving more credit to stories that are changing and like have errors because they're less thought out or something? Like this is how you test your logic and your biases to see if they work in the real world, because this logic of this story changing gives it merit. It doesn't work at all in the real world.
What about, this is kind of the big one, what about who visited him changing from the 1832 account where he just says, the Lord came to me? He literally just says the Lord. And then by 1838, he's saying God the Father appeared with his son, and one said, behold, behold, this is my beloved son, hear him. And then he introduces the son, and then the son speaks. How catastrophic or damaging is that difference to you, Winston, as kind of fresh eyes on this?
I mean, that's pretty bad. I mean, again, like I could explain it, like if I really wanted to, yeah.
Well, to me, it's like if you were telling the story of the important people came to town today, and I was able to meet the vice president, and we had this great conversation. It was so wonderful to talk to him for a while. And then a few years later, you're telling the story to someone and you say, oh yeah, I remember the day when the president of the United States and the vice president were there, and they came and talked with me, and I got to talk, and the president said XYZ, and then the vice president said XYZ and all that. You would wonder, well, in your first telling, would you really forget to mention that the president was there? And you would only mention the vice president?
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't make sense to the creator of the universe, who never shows up for anybody, but he's going to show up for you and introduce Jesus to you. And oh yeah, I forgot to mention that. Yeah, the Father was there as well. Yeah, sorry about that.
I mean,
guys.
It would have to be unclear, like who was who. Like you would have to thought that it was like, oh, it's like a bright light or something, and I thought it was, this deity, but it's the other one.
I can't imagine anything more astounding than if you take this story literally, if you really believed the creator of the universe showed up and you forgot to mention him. That's a little hard for me.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we made that point. let's go to the video.
We were playing a game last week, and part of the game was you had to tell an embarrassing story from the past. And this girl started telling her story, and she finished. She goes, "I forgot to say the embarrassing part." She had said the whole story, but forgot the one most important part.
Yeah.
So then she went back and retold the story. And even though it was the same story, 2 minutes apart from each other, there were more details the second time. There was a different perspective on the second time. And then she got to that important part.
Yeah.
Likewise, Joseph Smith, some of these accounts, it's on the fly. I'm going to share this experience, and it was an incredible experience. Other times it is planned, thought out. He's thinking about the sentences he should say. He's thinking, like you said, he took out part of it when he went back the second time. And so some are planned where he's going to be able to think it through a little bit more. Some are just him talking to his friends.
Professor Schachter calls the difference that you're noticing spontaneous memory. That's what Joseph does in 1835. And when Joseph does that, it moves faster and it's less freighted down by his concern about his limitations in writing. When he does what Professor Schachter calls strategic memory, that is, today I'm going to write my past. He feels burdened by that. It's hard for him to do. He starts with a disclaimer, both in the 1832 autobiography and the 1838-39 manuscript history. And so you're exactly right. This is human remembering. And it can be frustrating. People want to say, well, just tell me what happened. Just do the past. And when I started out in history, I thought that I could do that. I thought I can recover a perfect past. You just show me the primary sources and I'll show you exactly what happened. And along the way, wise people like Professor Bushman and others said, son, you cannot do that. And thinking you can do that is a cognitive distortion in itself. It's not a very well considered view. And this is how Dan Vogel's biography of Joseph Smith starts out. He says, since there are these multiple records over time, how certain can we be that Joseph remembered the vision that it actually happened at the time? And his point there is clearly he can't. He didn't remember it as it happened. He made it up or he misremembered. And then the next thing Vogel says is, so I'm going to tell you what actually happened. I call that subjectivity squared, right? If you think I can take Joseph's subjective accounts and turn them into an objective account, how? By what magic or miracle? You can't, Professor Bushman teaches us. You can only take Joseph's subjective accounts and you can study them super carefully and well, and you can add your own subjectivity to it. You've just multiplied subjectivities. You haven't arrived at some perfect, pristine version. We can only approximate the past with the historical method. And then we have to decide, well, am I going to believe? Am I going to believe the gist of the idea that God called Joseph Smith? He visited him and forgave his sins and so forth. That's a matter not of historical proving or not proving. A historian lacks the tools to prove any of that beyond any kind of doubt. There'll always be doubt.
Unless they have a time machine.
Yeah, that'd be cool, wouldn't it?
Wouldn't it?
I would pay a lot for a magic school bus.
But then it wouldn't be his.
Okay, so Dan, he invokes your name, so I got to give you a chance, and then I think Winston may have a comment as well. Anything you want to say to that?
Okay, there's so much there. He mischaracterizes what I said in the introduction to my biography because this is what I said. When Smith fails to mention foundational visions until years after the event, like Peter, James, and John, and gives conflicting and anachronistic accounts of them, like Moroni saying that Elijah would come with the priesthood in the 1838 account, which in 1823, he's saying Elijah's going to come and restore the priesthood. Come on. How certain can one be that Joseph relates events as he experienced them at the time? Okay, so I'm questioning whether he experienced them or not. Okay, I don't think he experienced them. Okay, I am bouncing off of what Bushman said. Okay, in his biography, I think it's his first biography, Joseph Smith and the Beginnings of Mormonism, which he is bouncing off of Robert F. Berkhofer's a behavioral approach to the book historical analysis. And Berkhofer, in his 1969 book, says that we should try to understand such experiences in the way in which the actors themselves understood them. Okay, he's not talking about supernatural events. He's just talking about your everyday stuff. Then Bushman says, in his 1984 biography, my method has been to relate events as the participants themselves experience them, insofar as the revelations were told a reality to them. I have treated them as real in this narrative, which I don't have a problem if somebody had a actual vision, okay, and had a religious experience, and they described them. I wouldn't be saying anything about it, because I would just say, humans hallucinate, so they have the ability to hallucinate. So I would just go with what they described. I wouldn't have to necessarily turn that into a naturalistic explanation every time. But so I was bouncing off Bushman. So he's assuming that the participants have experienced these things, that Joseph Smith experienced the first vision, or the angels or whoever. So he assumes them, and he just says, I'm just going to not be critical at all. I'm just going to describe the story as they described it. And as we've been talking, which time, which one are you going to choose to describe? So how can you describe the event, the first vision, as Joseph Smith experienced it, when he contradicted himself? Don't you need to address that as a historian? If you're going to be a critical historian, you can't just brush that aside and just give some, vanilla version of stuff.
But the way the church is handling that in the modern era is to say they're all true. They're basically saying they're all true. They just each tell a non-full story. So what we do is we combine them all. Yeah, and they've even produced videos in the past 5-ish years that basically tell an account as if all the versions are true, right?
So you could theoretically get postmodern on us and start trying to talk about multiple truths and all that, and what is truth and all that kind of stuff. But Bushman is proclaiming that he's going to describe it as they experienced it. How can you do that? You can't do that. You only can talk about the text, the narrative. That's all you can talk about.
Right.
And you can make the most probable reconstruction, one that is the most defensible, okay, which is what we've been doing.
Yeah. Yeah. Winston, did you have a quick reaction?
Oh, I just thought I was amused by my friend forgot the punchline of a joke at a party, so it makes sense that that Joseph Smith would forget that he saw God.
Well, why is that funny?
It's just I feel like they're very different scenarios.
One's a glib, funny, superficial thing, and the other is
something that you'd remember.
Well, at the start of his clip, he says, well, some of the accounts were just off the cuff comments to friends. But then you have the ones that are the serious, where you sit down and deliberately try to tell your story. And I'm thinking, yes. And the 32 account was one where he sat down and deliberately tried to write out his story. And the problem is that's the one that contradicts the later accounts. Yes, the middle one, the 35 account, where he's just talking to somebody, you can say, oh, yeah, he could make a mistake and misspeak on an off-the-cuff account. But what do you do with the ones that are deliberately written out?
And contradicting themselves.
And
in his own handwriting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just get the sense that, you can grant the memory issues, and you can grant that, maybe he was writing a different, he was made a mistake when he was talking to someone. You can grant all of these arguments they have, and their story still doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, because gods don't deliver books to people on golden plates. That's not how the world works, I don't think.
Well, even if he did,
Sterling McMurrin.
a little more sense.
Yeah. No,
That was
you're right.
Sterling
That was Sterling McMurrin's thought. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, could he have at least like manufactured some golden plates instead of like having to make up like the lie that they disappeared? You know?
Well,
Dan,
no, he
don't you-
couldn't make up gold plates. He couldn't afford it.
Yeah.
but Dan, you think he manufactured like tin plates, right?
Yes, and Ann Taves thinks he did make tin plates as the most probable explanation, and but that somehow he believed that they transmuted, just like the Eucharist in the Catholic Church, transubstantiation. Believed that the tin plates that he made turned magically into gold plates.
But he knew they couldn't pass visual inspection, so that's why he would cover them.
My argument is that no one saw them uncovered, not even the 8 witnesses.
Right.
The best analysis of their statements, all of their statements taken as a whole, show that it was a visionary experience, but a physical experience with the touching through the cloth in the box some way. And I use Martin Harris as one example. I mean, John Whitmer said they were shown to us by a supernatural power. That doesn't sound like the plates sitting on a log to me. So Martin Harris said that they didn't see them with their natural eyes, implying that it was the spiritual eyes that they saw them with. But how? Well, Harris goes on to say, according to Stephen Burnett's 1838 letter, that Harris went on to say in public, a public meeting, any of the 8 witnesses that were alive could challenge him. And he said, he saw them many times. He just told Joel Tiffany in 1859 this same thing. I saw them many times where they were wrapped in a cloth, sitting on my knee. That's what he told Joel Tiffany. And then he told the public in 1838 in Kirtland that he saw the plates as you see a city through a mountain with the eye of the imagination. And so I think that is what he is saying, that the 8 witnesses, how they experienced it.
Right.
And that's why the 8 witnesses weren't highlighted in the 1830s or 40s. You know, they weren't highlighted. It was the 3 witnesses because they saw an angel and the plates, and the 8 witnesses only saw them spiritually.
Interesting. Isn't it just like on its face ridiculous? I've got the plates. God gave them to me through an angel, but you can't see them. Like,
Yeah.
isn't that?
You're right.
No. Yeah.
Yeah, well, you read the statement of the 3 witnesses, and it's obviously a supernatural vision experience. It's not literally setting the plates out on the table for them to look at, because they have to go out and pray about this. And Martin doesn't get the vision and has to separate from David and Oliver for them to have the vision of the plates. And then later, Joseph meets with Martin Harris and they pray together. And then Joseph recounts that the same vision was opened to him and Martin as had been opened to Oliver and David. And then we aren't talking about people seeing a real object. We're talking about a hallucination, vision, dream experience, not reality.
Yeah.
Well, I don't try to decide whether the vision was real or not. I don't get in. I try to avoid that metaphysical argument.
Well, even if the vision were true, the point is they didn't physically sit on the table.
No, but my answer to that is that to decide whether the vision was real or not was a hallucination, because you can't tell the difference. People who hallucinate think it's real, you know. So, and you know, God would communicate with us that way is kind of strange when he knows that humans hallucinate. But So the way to decide whether it's a real one or not is whether the Book of Mormon's history. If the Book of Mormon's not a true history, then there were no Nephites and there were no plates, and Moroni couldn't appear to the three witnesses because he didn't exist.
Right. Very good.
Well said, Dan. All right, let's go to the video.
History, then it'd just be like journalism because you're actually seeing it. You're right there with it.
Yeah, and I'm not entirely positive that if I were there in the woods of Western New York on that spring morning that I would see what he saw.
Mhm.
I might be standing right next to him and not invited
Right.
to the vision. I don't know.
As were many of the visions that
That's
Joseph
crazy.
Smith had.
Certainly in February 1832, he and Rigdon were privy to a series of visions that people standing in the room with them
Right.
did not see.
Right. There's an incredible
All right,
book.
well,
and
so what, Hero, do you think that's significant? Why?
Yeah,
Why?
because he's talking about, he's admitting it was not a visitation, probably. Like
It was
God-
not a natural supernatural.
right.
Richard Anderson called it a natural supernatural experience, meaning the angel came down right in the woods. He was there physically before the witnesses.
That's a
and
really good point.
the plates were there and the table was there and all the other objects were actually there. That's what Richard Anderson tried to argue. But David Whitmer made it very clear that he was questioned by James Moyle, who was a young man. I forget the date, 1850s. I can't remember the date of it, but James Henry Moyle was in law school and he was coming back to Utah and he stopped by and interviewed David Whitmer and he questioned him specifically. This is where the answers you get from the witnesses is as good as the person doing the interview, because he asked him specifically, was it material? Because in other accounts, oh yeah, it was solid as this and that. But James Henry Moyle went away and he wrote in his diary at the time, and he's published other statements saying that he was disappointed in the answer because it was more spiritual than I had anticipated. And he said he described something like a soft haze, seeing it in a soft haze. So it was an experience that was not in the environment, but superimposed on the environment.
Yeah.
The haze is part of what researchers would call part of the vision, the light. If he appears in a light, well, the light is the vision part of it, superimposed on the natural world, not part of the natural world.
Yeah.
So that's the testimony that a lot of the apologists don't want to highlight.
Yeah, and Gerardo, you really made it audible, almost gasped when he said that. And I think it's a smoking gun for this entire conversation, in my view, and the way I was taught Mormonism. Because what are some of the distinguishing features of modern Mormonism? One is that God and Jesus are two separate beings and are,
Physical, with bodies.
But that was the
Flesh
second
and
part.
bone.
One is that they're not a trinity, all three but one but three, but that they're two separate beings, that Jesus is literally the Son of God, with God coming down and somehow impregnating Mary, and a baby comes out, and that's Jesus. And then when Jesus grows up, gets killed, and is resurrected, he's up there in heaven as a separate physical body. That's the second part, with 10 fingers, 10 toes, a beard, like full anatomy, but that also that God has a full human anatomy like Jesus. So they're physical beings appearing to Joseph Smith in the Grove in 1830, the year 1838 version. And if that's true, and that is Mormon theology and doctrine, the whole temple ceremony is based on this, then why in the world would Stephen Harper say that if I were there in the Grove and God and Jesus appeared with their 10 fingers and 10 toes and beards and full body, that he wouldn't see anything? That makes no Mormon sense to me at all. It's an admission that there's something wrong with this story, in my view. Am I overblowing that?
I think you're right.
Well, but I can see how the apologist would say, well, yeah, you wouldn't see it because you're an unbeliever.
No, but it's a physical body. That's the
Yeah.
whole point. It's not a vision. It's two physical bodies
Well,
appearing
but even
above
the
Joseph.
telling of the story is they appear in the glorious light. And so that puts it in the framework of a heavenly visitation, not just two guys physically standing next to you.
I mean,
I think
God,
most
so
Mormons-
God is physical. So God and Jesus. Let me try and make sense of this, Sandra. It's fun that you're playing the role of the apologist and the believer, and I'm the skeptic.
Yeah, what side do you want to argue? I'll take the other side.
No, so somehow God and Jesus have physical bodies, bones, flesh, bones, celestial blood, all the anatomy, 10 fingers, 10 toes. But when they actually appear to Joseph in a physical place, in a grove where Joseph's there and they're there, that somehow they're going to say, well, we're going to make it so we disappear to the natural human eye, and only Joseph's going to see us because we've got some sort of, it's almost like a Lord of the Rings
Star
or Harry
Wars.
Potter invisibility cloak,
Yeah.
where they're physical beings, but they're wearing, what's the cloak in Harry Potter, Winston? The one that makes Harry Potter invisible?
Invisibility cloak.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what they're called.
So they're physical bodies, but they're wearing some invisibility cloak so that you can only see them if you're A, named Joseph Smith, or B, have the eye of faith, but that Stephen Harper, if he had been there, wouldn't be able to see them at all. I mean, this is really starting to strain credibility.
John,
Wait, I have
Yeah.
little faith. I have little faith.
you just have not prayed about this.
Okay, got it.
If you
Coming
would
from a
ask
biased
sincerely with
place.
real intent,
Got
I
it.
thought about it as like but to me, he's thinking more about it as like this Star Wars, like where they communicate with other people, where what I don't
Like
know what it's called.
Jedi mind sort of communication.
Yeah, that kind of stuff.
So they're not actually speaking with their voice. They have mouths. God and Jesus have mouths.
Yeah.
They have vocal cords. Like the resurrection was real. So they've got all these physical bodies. They just hide them and don't use them whenever they want to appear to somebody.
yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So why do they have them? Like, what's the point?
Or like a call, like a virtual call, like they're in call-up and then they're like appearing at
They're like holograms.
yeah, like holograms.
So they're actually not physically there. They're projecting. They're casting forth projections as holograms
In
to
Joseph's
Joseph.
mind.
But they're there. They're Joseph's mind.
Yeah, because then Stephen Harper couldn't see it. So it has to be in Joseph's mind.
Basically, God has a physical body, but he
doesn't-
decided that it was better, to just make it like, a vision.
Like a hologram.
Yes, hallucination.
Why? Why? But why have the body if you're not going to use the body? Why have it? Right? If you're going to hide it, why have it? What's the point?
Yeah.
And
Well,
then how's it a special thing? Why didn't Joseph just say, like, that's the thing the church wants their cake and eat it too. Or in the 1838 version, he wants his cake and he wants to eat it too, because he's saying God and Jesus appeared to him. He's not saying I had a dream and in my dream, I saw God and Jesus. He's saying I knelt down in a forest, in a physical place, and I prayed and I looked up. Like, why is he looking up? He could be asleep. Like, why does he need to look up if they're just nowhere and they're just in his mind? So then God's projecting an image such that he would look up. That almost makes God a deceiver, right? If God's not really there, but he's making Joseph look up as if he actually is there.
Well, it's like television. You're looking at the screen.
Yeah, it's like these dudes in blue screen who are pretending that they're fighting Thanos, but really they're wearing little skin tight exercise joggers, miming in front of a blue screen, but Thanos isn't actually there, but they're pretending like he is. Like, it just seems
But that's
unbelievable.
why the historian has to deal with just what the accounts say. We can't determine whether or not there was a vision happening in that grove, but we can examine all of the data that we have about the event to try to determine what happened that we can conclude from the records that we do have.
But I'm more interested in why Stephen Harper would feel compelled to say that if he were there, he wouldn't see anything. Like, that's interesting. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
I don't know. To me, it's like, it's compared to the other mental gymnastics, it's not that much, you know, to just say that God would do it like a hallucination instead. Like, we're talking about some, you know, there's some pretty serious, you know, like.
Well, you're getting into the metaphysics physics of the
to
whole
me,
thing.
to me, it just shows like he doesn't believe it the way that most Mormons
Yeah.
would believe the vision happened.
Yeah, but once you're there, once you have adopted, once you're like an employee of the church, an official church historian, you're teaching students at BYU, and then you believe a completely different narrative than
Yeah.
you know the church has taught everyone for a long, long time, including when their missionaries are going out and bringing people into the church. Like, you have it. Isn't there some point where you have an ethical duty to not just tell a little limited audience on a YouTube channel where you know there are going to be people who are questioning or doubting may watch? Like, if you believe a narrative fundamentally different than the prevailing narrative that the church is telling everyone, there's an ethical problem or obligation there, in my view. I think.
I was wondering if what he was trying to say is just that it wasn't an important detail to him. Like, doesn't matter how he showed up, but it does go against there's definitely like a narrative that they're trying to make it seem like a physical body.
My point is, there is no more important detail than whether two physical bodies showed up that day.
Yeah.
Is there a more important detail in all of Mormonism?
We were all raised to view that as evidence that God had a physical form. That was
Right.
given to us as one of the purposes of the vision, was for us to know that the Father has a physical form.
Right.
That's the whole reason we were sent to earth. The whole plan of salvation is we were spirits before we came to earth. Then we were sent to earth. Why? Why, Gerardo? Why were we sent to earth? What? Sandra, why were we sent to earth?
To get our bodies.
To have a body. So then we were sent to earth to have a body so that when we were resurrected and appeared to people, we could hide the fact that we actually have a body and make it obscure and questionable. And that's just weird.
Yeah, I just want to know, like, what did Joseph Smith do that he gets to be the one that gets to know for sure, but everybody else, like, we intentionally take away all evidence so that we all have to be able to, like, believe without any evidence, like, for us to be able to be saved. But he just gets to do it, like, for, you know, he gets all the evidence.
Well, I have to tell you my little kid story. As a young Mormon, as a child praying, I was so sure that all of this was literal, that if 14-year-olds prayed that you could get a real vision, and real stuff happened, that I would pray at night, God, I need the, XYZ precept, keep my puppy from dying, whatever. But don't send an angel. I don't want anyone to show up, because that just scared me to death. Because I assume, from my teaching, I assumed this stuff literally happened. That if a young person prayed, God could show up, and it terrified me. So it's kind of funny when Mormons say, "Well, you didn't really believe." Man, I believed so much that I didn't dare pray for fear I was going to get a vision, and I was scared of the dark. I didn't want anyone showing up.
Yeah.
No.
Does Dan have any? Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, but it all was presented to us as a very literal experience, is the point.
Yeah.
That is the point, is that in Mormonism, God and Jesus have physical bodies, and that they physically appear to Joseph Smith. So for me, that's a major concession, and it makes me feel good about our title, which is basically Mormon Historian Admits First Vision Problems Raised in the CES Letter, right?
Wait. Well, he already said it's 50-50, right?
It's 50-50. Yeah.
So,
you were going to ask Dan if he had any comments on this?
Yeah, well, just like if you have any ideas, Dan, of why he would be compelled to say something like this.
Joseph Smith, what was the statement?
Why is Harper?
Well, Harper, okay. Why would he say? I have no problems with what Harper said about those without spiritual eyes would not see even a physical being. I mean, so that's just a metaphysic deal. Who knows? Nobody has any firsthand knowledge of this stuff.
Yeah.
So they can do anything. I would only add that the father having a physical body didn't come to Joseph Smith until the 1840s in Nauvoo. So the question is, how did Joseph Smith understand, even though it didn't happen? How did he understand, or want his followers to understand how he saw Jesus and the Father? So I would refer you to the Doctrine and Covenants at the time, had the lectures on faith, right? And the 5th lecture on faith said that the Father is a personage of spirit, and the Son is a personage of tabernacle, and that they're joined by the same mind. So it doesn't say the Father is a personage of spirit and flesh, and it doesn't say the Son is a personage of tabernacle and spirit. You see where I'm going? So, in the Book of Mormon, there's that modalism, right? Where the Father actually comes down. Jesus is both the Father and the Son. The Father, this is Mosiah chapter 15. He's the Father. Jesus is the Father because of the Spirit, and the Son because of the flesh. So, and they both have, and there's the will. Both of them have the will. The will of the Son is swallowed up in the will of the Father. Well, all this is talking about is that the Father is separate than the Son. The Son is just the flesh. The flesh has a will of its own, and it's just like us. Supposedly, and we're supposed to submit the will of the flesh to the will of the Spirit, right? So you can have Jesus has the mind of the Father. He's filled with the Spirit of the Father, and he in this type of modalism, the Father can appear as a spirit, and the Son can appear as the flesh, and they're the same person, really. So I'm suggesting that even though there's two, and even in D&C 76, they saw the Son on the right hand, or the glory of the Son on the right hand of the Father. And in the 1832 account, it says, "I am the Lord of glory," right? Which means that he has the body, and he was glorified in being resurrected. He's the Lord of glory. So even though the Mormons like to read the 1838 account as, that proves that the Father and Son are separate, it doesn't really.
Good point. Thank you, Dan. I'll just say one final thing. It is absolutely true. Two things are absolutely true. Tell me if I'm wrong, Sandra and Dan. One is that the lectures on faith paint a very different picture about the nature of God and Jesus than the 1838 account of the first vision. Is that correct?
Yes.
Second is that the lectures on faith used to be part of the Mormon scriptural canon, correct?
Yes.
And the third part is what, Sandra?
I don't know where you're going.
That they were removed.
They were
conveniently removed from the scriptural canon.
And part of the reason they're removed is because they had a confusing view of God.
Yeah.
The leaders saw it as being confusing.
Right.
Well, they were the part that says doctrine.
Yeah.
Right. That was the doctrine of the Doctrine and Covenants.
The doctrine was the lectures on faith.
Yeah.
Right.
But they were removed because they represented Joseph's view of the Godhead at the time he was writing them.
1835.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so again, they remove, they conveniently just yank out the doctrine out of the Doctrine and Covenants as yet another evidence of Joseph's both evolving view of of God, of the Godhead, but also of the church's willingness to brazenly,
Changes
hide
history.
or change or alter or destroy, inconvenient past beliefs that are conflicting. All right, let's keep going with the video. We're actually kind of getting closest to the end.
And this is a little bit of a tangent by Carl Ricks Anderson, Savior in Kirtland.
Yeah.
And he talks about how there's secondary visions where the person isn't experiencing the vision, but they're seeing people having the vision. And for one of the accounts, the woman's like, I know that they were having a vision because they were bright. They were illuminated, even though I couldn't see the vision they were having, which is just incredible to me.
It's pretty cool.
Sorry, that's a tangent. But the last thing I'd like to talk about today, and to me, I think that this is one of the biggest concerns I know many people have, is late appearances of the first vision. So before we dive into why that might be, I want to first ask, Joseph Smith has his first vision, boom. Well, who does he tell immediately after? And I do this test with my friends, my roommates often, and they're immediately like, well, he went and told his dad. They're thinking about the story of Moroni coming. Yeah. They say he goes and tells his mom, because he goes and tells his mom. She says, what's the matter? He says, well, I just know Presbyterianism isn't true. We don't know if he tells her the whole first vision. Likely he didn't, unless you want to correct me if I'm wrong.
I think it's likely that he didn't.
But long story short, he didn't tell these people. So who all did he tell, and why didn't he tell more people?
Terrific question. So I'm going to answer it with precision. I'm going to do what we invite everyone to do. Think slow.
Right.
So you know how you know what you know. What you're asking me, what do I know about who Joseph told and how do I know it? Well, what I know, I hear this all the time, but everybody out there, listen super carefully. I don't know who he tells and when he tells. What I know is what the historical records say about that. And what they say about that is that the earliest account of the vision, 1832 history, says, I could find no one who would believe the heavenly vision. He does not say who he tried to find, who he told, just I could find no one. We have nothing else in the historical record from Joseph about who he told until we get to the manuscript history, when he says, some few days after this vision, I happened to be in company with a Methodist minister who was influential in the aforementioned religious excitement. I took the occasion to tell him of the vision, and he responded with great contempt, saying it's all of the devil. That is all the historical record says about who Joseph tells and when. Now, a careful thinking person will limit themselves to that. They will not pretend to know anything other than that about who he tells. A not carefully thinking person will say, well, of course he tells his mom and dad. Of course he tells everybody else. To which
they do some presentism. If this happened to me, I'd go and tell my family. Yeah. So why wouldn't Joseph Smith tell his family?
Exactly. And I call that, as you know, hypothetical history. If this happened to me, this is how it would have gone down. To which I say, how do you know?
Right. Didn't happen to you.
Yeah, you don't know what you would do if you were Joseph and in that environment and in those circumstances. You don't even know what you would do or I would do, right? It's nothing more than my imagination about what would happen if. That's a terrible, terrible, terrible way to find out what actually happened in the past. It sets you up for being devastated because your knowledge is your imagination. And then you compare, finally, you get around to the historical records and you find they don't confirm your imagination. And you think the history never happened the way you knew it happened. All you did is thought too fast and too lazily and were devastated that what you assumed is not a sound assumption. Well, people who think slower and more carefully don't have that problem. And people who are taught the historical record the way I was taught it by Professor Backman, and taught interpretation of the historical record the way I've been taught it by Professor Allen or Professor Bushman, they don't have that trouble. It's another way to say this is, it's not people who know too much about the first vision who disbelieve it. It's people who think they know more than they do about the first vision. Yeah.
And I think the most...
All right, I just got to check in on that. So Winston, I want to sanity check that. He's basically saying it's ridiculous to expect anything once you find out that Joseph had this vision. That's just, it's off limits to expect any behavior, because none of us would know what we would do, let alone what Joseph would do. What do you think about that argument?
I mean, it would be weird if he didn't tell anyone, but it's not impossible.
Okay.
I don't know. What do you guys think?
Well, I think that
I'm with Winston.
Well, let's think about this a minute. Okay, we don't have corroborating accounts of Joseph telling within 3 days or so of this vision a minister about the experience. if we're going to talk about recovered memories that you intermingle with what really happened or whatever, are there accounts of his having problems with ministers or church leaders? And I would say yes. And I think this is one of those memories that he has pulled out to put in a different place in his story. Because in 1828, when he tries to join the Methodists and he signs up for their class for the period of training you would take before membership to be sure that you have been converted, his name is on the records for a period of time. But then the people that ran the class, who were, I think, Emma's cousins, the Hiles, they say, we wouldn't let him join because of his necromancy. We did not think it was proper to have a necromancer as a member of the church. Now, it's a late recollection, but we have that late account challenged by another man from the class who says, well, his name was only on the class roll for a few days. It wasn't on there for a long period of time. And Joseph took it off voluntarily. So you have different members of the class arguing about how long his name stood on the records, not whether or not the class was there, not whether or not Joseph attended the class, and not arguing over whether or not there was a problem with him joining. Everybody knows he didn't join. So why didn't he join? The fellows running the class said, we wouldn't let him join because of his magic involvement, and which they saw as a work of ill repute amongst the Christian community. We didn't think it right to have a necromancer in the church. So I see Joseph as taking that effrontery from those men and moving it into his first vision story to make it after his first vision account, rather than being rejected by the clergy because of his money digging.
Dan? Is it ridiculous? Is it presumptive and bad history, and even ridiculous to assume that he would tell anyone for 12 years?
Well, we should all at least acknowledge that it is strange if he didn't. So maybe he didn't tell anyone. So that's a problem. I mean, in court of law, if you were testifying and then you said, and you're testifying about something that happened in the past, to bring someone forward that heard you talk about it in the past rather than making it up to impugn somebody in the present, right? I'm thinking, let's say, sexual impropriety recently in some testimony against certain politicians or justices, and they go, well, did you tell anybody at the time? That would help us, believe what you say. You're not making it up now because you don't like this person, right? So that would help, but we don't have it. So that's a problem for his credibility, So, but Sandra is saying that, the minister that he told, and the minister, what did the minister say in the 1838 history? It's very odd. It's an odd statement. So, according to Joseph Smith,
no visions today.
You're right. There's no more revelation, right?
Yeah.
There's no more revelation now given. God doesn't give revelations anymore, which is really weird for a Methodist to say, since they're in the revivals. People are speaking in tongues and seeing into heaven, having heavenly visions. But to say God gives no more revelations nowadays, well, it sounds to me like Joseph didn't tell him about the first vision. He told him about the Book of Mormon, about the plates, about the necromancy.
Yeah.
right? So, but Sandra's idea that he may have actually experienced that in 1828 would be, that's kind of an interesting idea. I have wondered if it was just Willard Richards, Willard Chase, excuse me. Willard Chase was a Methodist clergy, according to later census records, and a Methodist minister or clergy. And maybe, I doubt if he's actually talking to one of the, like Reverend George Lane, you know, but I do think it was probably during the 1824-25 revival that he's talking to this minister and mentions the plates, and then he gets the answer, well, God doesn't give revelations. That makes sense.
Yeah,
You know,
like more
if he's-
Bible. There can't be more Bible.
no more Bible, no more
Yeah.
revelation. So that's how I've suggested. It's an interpretation that to me seems to make more sense than the story that Joseph actually told.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, we're getting close to the end. Let's go ahead and play the final few minutes.
Most important thing that I would say, at least that I'm getting out of today, is go and study the primary accounts
For yourself.
and then triangulate it with the Spirit.
Right.
Allow God to tell you what is the truth. Allow Joseph Smith himself to tell you what is
Yeah.
the truth. And then let's test. Let's go into it. Let's read why are there these differences? How can I work through these? But I'm here to testify that the first vision happened. I think you, who have studied it more than just about anybody we could get, would testify that it
I
happened.
testify that it happened.
But it only comes by your personal study. It doesn't matter what you say. It doesn't matter what I say.
That's right.
It matters what God says to you as you study it.
Yeah. It's a fallacious or an error for me to try to tell people you should believe it because I'm an authority and I believe it. I don't. That's not what I'm saying to anyone.
Right.
I'm saying I've done a lot of work on this, and I believe it. And I'm offering that as an invitation to anyone else to do that work themselves. And I don't know that they'll arrive at the same conclusion I have, but I know that they can't tell me that I don't know what I know. I'm inviting them to have the same wonderful experience that I've had. I hope they do. And, that's all I'm asking for.
And if they do not, it doesn't discount what
No.
you have experienced.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. I mean, think of it. Somebody's going to get on my case for bearing my witness. Well, the critics are bearing their witness. I know beyond a shadow of a doubt the first vision didn't happen. And you know my question, right? How do you know?
Mm-hmm.
How do you know? They've got to make a case that is similar to mine. Well, I've studied the historical records. Well, I doubt you've studied them more than I have.
Right.
Well, I know there's no spiritual witness. I know there's no revelation. How do you know? How do you know? And can you prove a negative that there's no spiritual witness? There's no revelation.
Right.
So I feel confident in my own epistemology, my own way of knowing, which combines hard-headed historical methodology trained by the very finest scholars, whom the Academy has recognized as the finest scholars. They didn't get an award from the church. They've been awarded and recognized by their peers.
Right.
And I've learned from them not only how to think carefully about historical records, but I've also learned from them and from Joseph himself, above all, how to ask in faith and seek and receive.
Right.
It works.
It works. Steve, do you have anything to add before we conclude?
All right. So he kind of threw down the gauntlet there. He's basically admitting that we shouldn't. That was good. He admitted that we shouldn't believe him just because he has credentials and, is a scholar and has studied stuff. But he's basically, holding himself up as saying you can know all this stuff and still believe. So believe if you want. I don't know. What do you guys think of that little?
He also testified that he said, I testified that the vision happened, but then also said that if he was there, he wouldn't see it. So that's interesting.
Well, he wants to make an appeal to history on the one hand, but then turn right around and say, besides that, I have this spiritual confirmation that it's true. But if the historical evidence shows a confusion of the story to the point of wondering what really happened and when it was supposed to have happened, then how sure could we be that if we got a positive feeling that would be trustworthy? I don't know how you have a checks and balance in the system when the spiritual experience obviously overshadows anything of the facts.
Triangulate it with how you're feeling while you're reading it. Yeah, and he's putting this like I believe without a shadow of a doubt like language on us. Like I would never use that language like talking about anything. Like what secular skeptic would ever say that they know that Joseph Smith didn't have a vision without a shadow of doubt? Nobody would. Religious people talk like that.
He was basically thinking of you, Sandra, and you, Dan. Sandra, he's saying you would bear your testimony that you know Joseph Smith didn't have a vision. That's what he was basically putting on you.
Well, he's not just saying that. He's saying we start from a premise there couldn't have been a vision. I'm not saying there couldn't have been a vision. I'm saying all the facts that he's given about it don't add up.
They don't make any sense.
So that I have a credibility problem accepting his story. Not that I can't accept anyone could have a vision.
You're a believer in visions, in fact.
Believe in, yes, I believe in Christianity. I'm not saying he couldn't have had a vision, but what are the historical evidences to back up his story? And they don't add up.
Dan, what do you think about the allegation that you would bear your testimony that Joseph Smith never had the first vision? What do you think about that sort of allegation to discredit you as someone who, can prove a negative, basically?
Well, gee, where do I go? I'm a naturalist. I don't believe in the supernatural. But I wouldn't say the supernatural doesn't exist. This is what I wrote in the introduction to my biography that he referred to, that I would never say the supernatural doesn't exist. I would only say that the evidence upon which it rests, there's no evidence for it existing. So
it kind of
I only go according to the evidence, and of course, there might still be claims that I don't know about. I could only go according to what is presented in that extraordinary things require extraordinary evidence kind of thing. I'm not even asking that actually. So I'm just asking for some consistency, some credibility. Joseph Smith doesn't have any credibility. He's blown his credibility so many ways.
Joseph or Harper?
Well, Joseph, but Harper. Now I realize he's a religious guy and he has welcome to his religion. But if you should at least admit, if you just look at it as a historian, and historians can't prove that there's no supernatural. We just don't have those kind of tools. But you should at least admit, like I said to Bachman all those years ago, that you should at least admit that Wes Walters won this debate so far. I mean, you need better arguments, better evidence. That's what I was asking for when I was still a believer in my early 20s. We need to work on this a little harder. And then I, as a young man, I saw the apologetic, very weak, flimsy, BS. It's not the whole Americas. It's this little tiny geography thing. That didn't fly with me as a young Mormon. I knew they were, blowing smoke, and the same thing with the first vision. Bushman, Bachman, they were just building apologetic devices to get out of trouble, but the trouble was still there. Their devices don't work. It's a fairy tale, what they spin every time to try to get, the DNA, it's one excuse after another of why they don't have evidence, or why the evidence is really bad for Joseph Smith in his first vision. I don't say that somebody else somebody else's vision isn't true necessarily. I'm a naturalist, of course. I don't believe we have to go outside the natural world to explain what happens in it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I feel like he was throwing down a straw man and an ad hominem at the same time, which takes quite a bit of skill, because he was basically claiming that you all denied something that you don't deny, and then using that to make it sound like you go beyond the bounds of what's ethical or proper as a human being and as a historian. You know, he was characterizing a position that you don't have, propping it up to then knock it down and dismiss you as unethical historians, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yes.
All right. Well, final concluding thoughts. I think we made it to the video. 3.5 hours to do a 45-minute video. That's on brand, right, Sandra?
Yeah, right.
We play the entire video.
What?
We played the entire video.
We played the entire video, except for like the last minute.
Yeah.
I'm going to give each of you a chance to give your final concluding thoughts. So, Winston, just to put you on the spot, final thoughts for today. Welcome to Mormon Stories. It's been fun to have you. I think the audience is going to say you performed exceptionally well as a 20-year-old who has studied Mormonism, almost none. But what do you have to say for concluding?
Lucky him.
Yeah.
My concluding thoughts are, I guess, just that it's an interesting discussion about the consistency of Joseph Smith's story. And even if Joseph Smith's story was extremely consistent, I still wouldn't believe in it.
All right, Gerardo, you're next.
I'll just say that the videos that Dan Vogel has put out on the first vision, they're a couple years old, but they're still really good. And he engages with Stephen Harper's arguments at the time, and Michael Quinn and all of the apologists. So they're really good. There are 3 of them. So I recommend anyone to go watch them, because there's a lot of there that we didn't talk about, like the modalist view that Joseph Smith would have had of the Trinity.
All right.
Yeah.
So shout out to Dan. So it's a segue to you, Dan. Final thoughts. Dan Vogel.
Thank you, Gerardo. Well, I will not bear my testimony that the first vision is not true. But I'll say the evidence is, as we explained here, that the 1832, 1838 account are vastly different from one another. Joseph Smith has a credibility problem with that. The Wes Walters was right about the revival not occurring in 1820. They've done nothing to change that. They've just tried to make an excuse to get around it. And they've missed an opportunity to be real historians, and, analyze the data and what it means when Joseph Smith, added the 1824-25 revival. There's a lot more to learn. There's a lot more to interpret. And they're just like stunting their development by doing this, what I call the apologetic treadmill, around and around and around and around. They would just keep recycling these old, tired apologetic excuses instead of grasping onto them and using them as tools to interpret and get more nuance to Joseph Smith.
Thank you, Dan. All right, Sandra.
Well, I think people have to keep in mind that the story of Joseph Smith is much broader than just this straight looking at the timeline of a first vision story. That all happened within a bigger context of his life. At the same time as these different accounts are going on, you have his involvement in magic and money digging, his 1826 trial on being a glass looker and a con man with that. You have the other events that are happening in his life that explain a lot of these ideas that pop up in his different visions, the way he changes his story is consistent with the way he changes everything else. He makes changes in his scriptures. He makes changes in his story. He's always revising everything. So the credibility problem enters into this. How seriously can I take this first vision account when I see that his whole life is a pattern of rewriting and reformulating his story? It takes a much broader look at his life to have a sense of his credibility beyond just the first vision problems.
Yeah, the Book of Abraham's a fraud. His alleged translation of the Kinderhook plates is shown to be a fraud because the plates themselves were frauds. We now know that the revision of the New Testament that he put together just came from a biblical commentary that we know he had in his possession. But
you know what's interesting? Just thought about it as Sandra was saying that. In the first video we did, Richard Bushman acknowledges that Joseph Smith goes back and revises his story to make it more convenient to him at the time, even if he's lying. Richard Bushman acknowledged that Joseph Smith changed the story of the stone and a hat when he was embarrassed by it later on, when it was not convenient for him to tell that story.
Yeah.
So we have apologists acknowledging that Joseph is a revisionist of his own story.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So, I mean, it's a really, and we're not even mentioning again, propositioning 14-year-old girls for sex and 16-year-old girls for sex and mother-daughter pairs and sister pairs and lying about it. And when Oliver Cowdery finds out he's in the barn with Finney Alger, excommunicating him, like, what do we need to just say this guy lacked basic integrity? You know what I mean? Why should the first vision story get a pass when almost every other part of his life was deeply, not just, semi-problematic, like deeply problematic? And he was killed. He was killed for violating the law and hiding and lying, his behaviors and just goes on and on and on. Anyway, I'll just say finally that I just have a real problem structurally with the church's continuation of this practice of paying scholars six-figure sums with retirement and fantastic benefits as employees at BYU to sort of use their degrees and their knowledge and their intellect as a way to say, I've reviewed the papyra and I went to Yale. And so, if I can believe in the Book of Abraham is historical, you can too. It's basically mixing oil and water. They're trying to rely on the traditions of science and of scholarship to bolster credibility, and then in a sleight of hand, get you to then believe when those two things don't belong together. Belief just doesn't belong with academia and scholarship. They should have scholarly discussions with BYU professors about what did or didn't happen, but then not end with bearing their testimony. If they want to bear their testimony, bear your testimony at church. Bear your testimony at a fireside where you're not talking about the history. But don't invoke the tradition of academia and scholarship and credentials and then end with your testimony. Because those things don't fit. Right?
Right.
They're separate things. Are they not separate things?
No.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Bear your testimony all day long. Just don't do it as a professor of BYU in an academic conversation about history. That's what I think.
Okay.
Anyway, that's my rant.
Okay.
Winston, thanks for joining us.
Yes, of course.
It's so great to have you.
Can I say one more thing?
Yeah.
I think at the beginning of the video, they said that video that was like a response that he'd been preparing for like Dan or someone. And in my understanding, like when you understand a concept well and you're really just trying to like figure out what's true, like you would be willing to have a discussion with someone like Dan instead of like prepare a response and then just like go on like a 40-minute basically like monologue with no actual like challenge to the things you're saying,
Right.
you would be willing to talk to someone who will raise some important questions that you're never gonna, be able to raise for yourself. And I don't think that like good and intelligent scholars are like just avoiding the opposing opinion and making videos by themselves.
So Dan, what would happen if you said, "Hey, Stephen Harper, let's appear in public at an event or on a podcast, and let's each lay out our claims and our positions and have a robust dialogue about each of our positions?" Because Winston asked, would Harper ever talk directly to Dan? Would that, in a million years, would that ever happen, Dan Vogel? And then I'm going to ask Sandra you the same question.
Well, I think BYU puts a damper on things like that. They won't even let them go to Sunstone, But I'm not much into trying to debate people unless it's the right person and the right time, place, and people have the right attitudes. I have debated though a few times, but
with who?
It was about the Spalding thing.
Lars
no. No. I don't think that would work. But
I mean, to Winston's point, would any of these, would Richard Bushman, would Stephen Harper, would any of these dudes ever be willing to, even if the church were to let them? Well, I guess we wouldn't know. I guess Winston, part of the problem is the church won't even let them. What does that say?
Well, I don't even mean like, I don't really love like public debate or anything either. I don't think it's like an effective way for people to learn, but like he would like maybe send you an email or like be like, "Hey, let's call and talk about this sometime." Cause we obviously, we're both historians and we see it really differently,
How about that? Would Dan Vogel, would Stephen Harper, have you all talked on the phone or tried to talk through these issues just directly?
Well, I've seen Harper at the meetings, historical meetings and things, but
So
I answer whatever emails I get. I've written like, say, Brian Hales even. We've had a correspondence back and forth, and I'm not adverse. I admire a lot of the Mormon historians actually, and people's beliefs I'm not out to deconvert people. I don't care about those kind of questions. Well, I'm like Wes and Mike Marquardt. We three used to get together and talk a lot on the phone, and we will help anybody. You know what I mean? We will help anybody that I like to have a cooperating spirit about myself. I don't push people to disbelieve, and I'm not going to like hammer on people. I don't care if they're Mormons or not. I don't care how many Mormons in the world there are. And I'm mostly interested in Mormons who have passed on a long time ago.
Well, I guess I was just saying, if he was really interested in like truth, he would be really interested in talking to you, especially as someone who he admitted he thinks is smart, right?
Well, there's lots of political things that go on between the various camps and how it would look. And there's some people are more or less conscious of the political boundaries. And I'm aware that I'm like sequestered in a certain way. Mm-hmm. I don't mind it that much, but if I make people feel uncomfortable, I don't want them to feel obligated to interact with me. That's fine. I'm good. But
I'll just say while you're thinking, Dan, I'll just say, Winston, you may be interested to know that, like, again, and Winston, I don't know even if you'll believe the story, but basically, I think it was Sandra who learned that this 1832 version of the Joseph Smith account that we're all talking about was withheld intentionally from the church membership, probably for, I don't know, anywhere between 50 and 150 years.
Yeah.
And Joseph Fielding Smith, who was church historian at the time, who was the son of a former prophet, and the grandson of Joseph Smith's brother, Hiram Smith, Joseph Fielding Smith, as church historian, in around what decade do you think Joseph Fielding Smith found the 1832 account?
Well,
what would you
we
guess?
don't know.
Would you
Maybe
guess?
in the 30s.
He stumbles on this 1832 account, which he realizes immediately isn't consistent with the 1838 official account. Can you guess what he did with it, Winston?
Tried to destroy it.
He literally ripped or cut it out of the journal that it was found in and hid it in a vault.
Yeah.
Until Sandra and Gerald found out about it, wrote publicly about it in the 60s. And then guess what happened to that account that had been ripped out
Did it get
of
exposed?
the journal? It got
Pasted
magically
back in.
taped back in to the journal. Like, is that condemning? I mean,
That's awesome.
and this is the woman. That's why I say this is you're speaking with some legends here, because
Yeah.
Sandra played an important
It's a big
role
deal.
of allowing all this to come to public
Yeah.
consciousness.
And I would say that he should, come talk to Sandra, but he obviously, probably thinks she's evil or something.
Yes, none of the historians want to engage with me. I don't qualify as a historian. I don't qualify as a scholar. Unlike Dan, I'm not out there in the academic world. And so I'm just another layperson telling what I've been able to glean from the historical record. But I mean, for years I sat in my bookstore and anyone was welcome to come by and challenge me, talk with me anytime they wanted. The only ones that came by were the people like Lou Midgley that wanted to come in and make trouble. But but like Dan was trying to point out, there are different camps. And for the Mormon historians, there are certain ramifications of being known to hang out with those of a more critical nature. And there's a guilt by association. And so those that are protective of their position in Mormonism have to watch who they hang out with, who they study with. And so it's a political problem of going across lines on discussions.
And that's ultimately maybe the most damning and compelling thing of all, Winston, because in the 60s and 70s and 80s, when this history started emerging and Sandra and Gerald and others started making this history that had been hidden from the members for 150 years, when they started making this public, and there was this golden era in the 70s and 80s where BYU professors, church historians would attend conferences with critics like Dan, like Sandra, like others. Guess what happened?
They shut it down.
The church basically said, if any church historians or BYU professors are caught at these conferences with people like Dan or Sandra, they'll be fired from their jobs.
Mm.
And some of the Institute of Religion and BYU people came to see us in the late 60s and early 70s. But when Reed Durham in 1972 gave his talk at Mormon History Association about Joseph Smith's Jupiter Talisman, and he got in trouble for the talk, that was some sort of signal. And from then on out, the church people more and more distanced themselves from coming and talking with us because there was this fear of guilt by association.
Yeah. So ultimately, I mean, we're all going through this because of decisions the top church leaders made, right? We're all Anyway, what a wonderful discussion.
Good.
Sandra, thank you for joining us today on Mormon Stories.
You.
We hope you'll come back. We're so grateful that you come out of retirement occasionally.
Yeah, every once in a while I come out of my little hideaway.
Gerardo, thanks for making this possible.
Thank you.
Winston, it's so fun to have you join us. Hope you'll come back.
Thanks.
And Dan Vogel from Ohio. Thanks for joining us, Dan. It's great to have you.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I enjoyed it. I hope you all do well this holiday season.
Absolutely.
All right.
Keep up the good work. Keep writing books, Dan. Will you do that?
That's all I do every day.
All right.
Good.
And Dan, you can check out pretty much all your books, Dan, are published with Signature Books. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I can't think of a better holiday gift for you and your loved ones than a book by Dan Vogel, right? Right, Dan?
Yeah. Yeah. The Charisma Under Pressure.
Is your latest book about Joseph Smith
Yes, the
Kirtland
middle years.
During the
The middle
Kirtland
years. Kirtland and Missouri.
And
How
Missouri.
can we get
That's right.
Signature Books to reprint the first one?
Yeah, how do we
Well,
get
they have it in Kindle.
the making?
But we want the physical copy.
Yeah.
Good
Well,
luck.
I don't. They're under new management.
We'll have to talk to.
We'll talk to
some
Barbara.
people.
We'll talk to Barbara.
Barbara. Yeah.
All right. Well, check out Dan Vogel's books from Signature Books. It's a perfect holiday gift. Sandra Tanner, if people want all the great publications, you are a scholar. You're one of the Mormon scholars. If people want to get copies of your books, how do they do it?
Well, they'd have to go to our website at utlm.org. And at our website, we have all our books up on the internet for free where you can go read them. Unfortunately, we aren't printing them anymore, but you can read them on the internet. If you wanted, you could print them off of the internet for your own copy. But all our stuff is there on the internet on our website.
And Julia, someday you're going to be providing printed copies of all of UTLM books. Is that right? Is that your goal, Julia? Add yourself to the chat. and tell-
If Sandra lets me, I would love that.
Julie wants to become your new publisher, printer.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure where all that's going to go.
But you have you approached her yet, Julia?
She talked to me about
I
it.
have,
but we
yeah.
haven't.
All right. Well, there's always hope. Hope springs eternal.
Okay.
All right. Anyway, Julia, thanks for also playing a role in today.
Yeah, of course.
And
Yeah.
maybe
I missed Julia.
Aw.
He
What's
must
that,
I
have-
Dan?
missed her. I missed her contributions. She's very knowledgeable too.
Oh,
yeah.
thanks.
Yeah, Julie is great. Julie's great. We're just thinking, do we have 6 people on this panel? Do we want to go 4 or 5 hours? Like, at some point. Anyway, Julia, thanks for what you do. Maven, also, thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Stories. Thanks to the donors. If any of you are donors out there within the sound of my voice, we couldn't do this without you. Thank you for your donations. If you're not a donor, you can help keep this program alive and shows like this alive by going to mormonstories.org, clicking on the donate button and becoming a monthly donor. Also, you help support us by watching those dang YouTube commercials or Spotify commercials. We apologize if they annoy you, but that's literally partly how we pay the bills. So please don't hate us for monetizing our content. Everybody else is doing it. We need to pay the bills just like everybody else. You can also support us by subscribing on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok for as long as it exists, along with Facebook. You can like our episodes, comment on them, and you can share them. Those are all the ways you can support us in addition to becoming a donor. Thanks again for joining us. We hope to do more in the coming days, weeks, months ahead. Be good to each other. Be kind to each other. And we will see you all again soon on another episode of Mormon Stories Podcast. So take care, everybody.